Wow. All right, here we are, folks. This is the day. This is the night. Welcome to the Breach Alberta election broadcast. I'm your co-host Aditya Rao. I'm in Ottawa, and we're coming to you live tonight. What an election this has been, neck and neck the whole way through. The whole way through, a nail biter, I'd say even. But more and more predictions for a UCP majority tonight. A surprising outcome for many if that's how this turns out, given that this is the NDP's election to lose. So, will they lose, or will Albertans return Rachel Notley to power? Well, we'll be covering the Alberta election tonight, and we will bring you the latest. We're speaking to organizers and analysts from across the province. We're going to get their views on the results and the implications of the election. And so I'm really excited to be joined by Martin Lukash, who will also be hosting tonight's show. Martin is the Breach's managing editor. Martin, how are you?
Pretty good, Addy. How about you?
Good.
And good evening, everyone else. I'm in Montreal, which I guess makes me an avowed public enemy in the right-wing imagination of Alberta, a paid-up member of the Central Canadian media cabal. Addy, on the other hand, you come by your Alberta analysis honestly. I think you spent nearly a decade living there.
Yeah, about 8 years. I finished high school in Drumheller in southern Alberta. Many of our
Nice.
viewers will know Drumheller as the land of the dinosaurs. I actually ran for the Alberta NDP in 2012 for in the Drumheller Stettler riding. It was a fun election.
We're just getting that off our chest right away. But we'll keep it a well balanced panel. Addy's got his NDP past. I've got something of a record of being a public critic of the NDP. So I think the makings of an interesting panel between us. And
Absolutely.
then a lot of amazing guests as well. Let's tell everyone a bit about what to expect tonight. While we won't be offering, real-time touchscreen 3D pyrographics of the results like you get with CNN and sometimes CBC, we will have multidimensional political analysis. We hope the analysis you'll hear tonight puts to shame the kind of bland punditry that you hear on the corporate outlets and our public broadcaster. We have got a great lineup of speakers, organizers, scholars, former members of government, and even a rural gun store employee. We'll have Beaver Lake Cree advocate Crystal Lehman. Actually, she's just stepped out because she got sick, so we'll have Angela Look stepping in for her at the very last minute. Climate organizer Emma Jackson, Parkland Institute Executive Director Ricardo Acuna, activist Romy Garrido, Executive Director of the Public Interest Alberta Brad Lafortune, and political activist Des Bissonnette. For those Succession fans out there, tonight will be of considerably lower stakes, like the ATN episode recently. We will most likely just be deferring to the other outlets when it comes time to call the winner. There won't be any backroom machinations here at the Breach. But the results tonight, for those who care about equality and justice, may be grim. But you'll hear perspectives that range tonight from sober to determined to hopeful about the ability of progressive movements to shape the coming terrain of political struggle. So stay tuned for that. And for those who are keen to watch the results live, we will have you covered on that front, starting at about 9:30. When the vote, sorry, I'm confused. There I go with the central Canadian parochialism. Results coming around 8 p.m. Mountain Time, 10 p.m. Eastern Time. And soon you'll be seeing a ticker appear at the bottom of the screen. In fact, it's already there. So it's going to start to fill out in about half an hour. It's going to show you the number of leading or elected MLAs for each party. Addy, why don't you give people a sense of the numbers that they should be looking for?
Well, wow, this is going to be quite the night, Martin. There are some 2.8 million eligible voters. There are 87 seats in the Alberta legislature, and the winner's looking for 44 seats to win. So, and actually, so far, this is the closest election that the province has ever seen. We're talking about a province that had 44 years of consecutive conservative governments, never a minority government. But the last 10 years have been unlike any other decade in the province. 6 different premiers in the last 10 years. Also, we know that more than a quarter of voters have already cast their ballots in advance polls, some 27%. One poll of voters who voted in advance suggests that it might actually be split between the NDP and the UCP, the results from the advance poll. So more to come on that. We'll be receiving those numbers as the night goes on. But there's a good chance that may have a bit of an influence on the final outcome. The other thing about what we need to keep in mind is that more voters voted in the advance polls this election than in the last election, than in the 2019 election, which had actually set the previous record for both advance polls as well as overall turnout, with nearly 70% of voters casting their ballots. So Martin, folks who are watching, pundits, observers, everybody's predicting high voter turnout this election as well. After all, the one thing that both sides of the spectrum is in agreement on is that the stakes have never been higher. For UCP voters, the message they're resonating with is that the NDP finished their term with high debt and high unemployment, and so they don't want more of that. The fact that the Alberta NDP doesn't control international oil prices, which govern provincial revenues, appears not to matter to that analysis. But the NDP, on the other hand, has been focused on the trustworthiness of Danielle Smith, and this has been an interesting approach, of course, because Danielle Smith is a person who was leader of the Wild Rose Party and ran to be premier in 2012. And in a totally wild, unanticipated move, she crossed the floor while she was leader of the official opposition to join Jim Prentice's governing Progressive Conservatives. She, of course, then tried to run for the PC nomination in her riding, which she had held as a Wild Rose MLA, and then lost, and then went to do her radio show. But now that she's leader of the UCP, it's kind of quite honestly remarkable that she's asking her own party members to vote for her, let alone the rest of Alberta. So we'll keep you updated, viewers, on key ridings, and we'll let you know as soon as the major outlets call the election. Of course, in Alberta, most ballots are counted by hand. Still, winners in many ridings will be determined pretty quickly. So at least if past elections are any indicator. And fortunately, the advance poll votes are going to be counted electronically, so fingers crossed we won't be on too late. So, well, speaking of past elections, why don't we take a look at some maps, Martin? Maybe we can take a look.
Run us through those.
Yeah, let's do that. So let's take a look at the map of Alberta. Here, what you have in front of you is the 2015 and the 2019 maps. On the left of your screen, you should be able to see the 2015 map. There's orange, there's green, there's blue. The green, of course, is the Wild Rose Party, and the blue is the Progressive Conservatives, and the orange, of course, is the NDP. You'll see that the NDP has swept all the urban areas, some rural ridings, especially north of Edmonton, and the Tories were, of course, divided between the PCs and the Wild Rose. This was sort of a historic election, right? Everybody was joking that hell had frozen over because the very next day it started to snow in May. In 2019, the map right next to this, you'll see that this is a total wipeout. The Tories were united in this election. They swept most of Alberta, all of rural Alberta. They took one of the two seats that the NDP had in Lethbridge. And that's going to be one of the seats that the NDP is going to want to win back this time around. So we're going to keep an eye on that. There was record turnout again, as we mentioned earlier, nearly 70% record advance polls. Another thing to note, I think that's important in terms of the numbers for tonight. The NDP vote share in 2019 increased a little bit in terms of the numbers. They had about 600,000 both in 2015 and 2019, 600,000 votes. But the UCP vote that united the fractured Conservative vote actually added another 500,000 votes. So from around 750,000 for the Wild Rose and PCs combined to over 1 million votes for the UCP. So that's how the NDP go down to 24 seats from 53. They lost one seat in Edmonton, but Calgary is the real shocker. And so let's actually jump to Calgary for a second, if that's okay. So here we are. We're looking at Calgary over here in front of you right now. You can see, we don't have the 2015 map for Calgary in front of you, but in 2015, the NDP had 14 seats in Calgary out of the 25. But in 2019, they were reduced to just 3 seats. And everybody this election is talking about battleground Calgary. This is what is on everybody's mind. What is going to happen in Calgary? This is easily going to be what determines how tonight is going to go. But the problem is that this is a really big ask. It's a really big challenge for the NDP. They've got Calgary McCall, Calgary Mountain View, and Calgary Buffalo, all three of which are considered safe NDP seats because they're former cabinet ministers. But they're also, the NDP's hopefully, according to them, hopefully get 3 more: Calgary Curry, Falcon Ridge, and Calgary Varsity. So if we don't see them keep their 3 seats, and we don't see them add these 3 new seats as a bare minimum with early results, I think we can say that the NDP is going to be in trouble. So that's Calgary. There's a lot riding on Calgary tonight, so we'll keep coming back to that, and we have some really great guests who are going to be able to tell us a little bit more about what's happening in Calgary. And I'll just finish off here with Edmonton. If we can go to the map of Edmonton over here, you'll see that Edmonton, of course, no surprise, is pretty much in the hands of the NDP. But there's one UCP riding in the bottom over there, and that's Casey Madhu's riding. Casey Madhu was the justice minister and the minister for labor after that, and the NDP really want to take this riding back. It was held by Thomas Dang in the 2015 election, and Thomas Dang is currently in office in the redrawn district of Edmonton South. Now, he's not running there again. That's important to note. In fact, the person running there is Rhiannon Hoyle in Edmonton South. And Rhiannon Hoyle is actually the former president of the Alberta Party. Alberta's weird politics, we'll have some time to dissect that as we go through the night. But the NDP have a star candidate lined up in Edmonton Southwest, a school board trustee, Nathan Epp. They're really, really hoping to take that riding. If the NDP can't take all of Edmonton this election, then that's absolutely going to spell doom. So the party is really focused on trying to get Edmonton. There's a huge effort down in Calgary. And so just to wrap up this conversation, let's take a quick look at the numbers once again. Between the last 2 elections. So here we have the 2019 numbers. You'll see that the percentage of support really shifted. The UCP got a fair amount of support across the province. The NDP support really plummeted, and the seat count really plummeted. So we're really looking at what's going to happen now tonight. As everybody is predicting really high voter turnout in 2019, that really high voter turnout actually worked against the NDP. So I think while folks are excited about a really high voter turnout, folks are really hoping that really high voter turnout is NDP voters coming out to vote if the NDP wants to see government again. So with that, we'll head back. I'll hand this back to you, Martin, and excited to hear your thoughts about this.
Addy, thanks for that thorough overview. I think our first guest of the night is available and on the line, Ricardo Acuna. Hey, Ricardo.
Hey, Martin.
Ricardo, let me introduce you. Ricardo is a longtime executive director of the Parkland Institute, a small but mighty progressive think tank doing battle in a sea of corporate and oil-funded think tanks in Western Canada. He's also the co-editor of a timely and terrific new book, Anger and Angst, Jason Kenney's Legacy and Alberta's Right, published this spring, very timely, by Black Rose Books. Before I ask you about this election, Ricardo, could you help us zoom out and kind of set the stage for us? Of the last 4 years, Jason Kenney was premier for 3 after having united the right and toppled Rachel Notley in 2019. You cover his fall from grace in your book, writing that his mistake was that he governed Alberta much the same way as when he headed up the stunt-pulling Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Break down for us what you mean by that and his record and legacy.
Sure. I mean, Jason Kenney becomes a rising star in conservative circles after he joins the Canadian Taxpayers Federation as its first national executive director. And he does this by being very, very good and learning early on that the best bang for his buck is to pull off stunts and to repeat the same far right talking points ad infinitum as loudly as possible. Those talking points for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation and Jason Kenney included regularly attacking and demeaning public servants as overpaid and spoiled, regularly attacking and demeaning politicians as pigs at a trough. In fact, one of his earliest stunts involves him laying out 300 and some plastic pigs on the lawn of Parliament Hill to highlight this is what politicians are doing with their pensions. And he learns very quickly that just repeating these points about Albertans being overtaxed and politicians and public servants taking those funds and Canadians being overtaxed really play well to a particular base across Canada, a base that's growing with the rise of the Reform Party, growing across Canada. And that feedback also at the same time as it's growing in the US, that very neoliberal, far-right, rhetoric-driven politics is what Jason Kenney's good at doing in that way that he just repeats the points and has the stunts. He gets elected federally, rises very quickly in the party for doing the same thing, essentially. His claim to fame in the Conservative Party federally is developing and executing the plan to bring ethnic and immigrant communities on board with the federal Conservatives. And what he does there crisscrosses the country, just like he had for the Taxpayers Federation, attending public events, throwing some points at these communities about how the Conservatives are much closer to their traditional and religious values, and how the Liberals and you Democrats and Bloc are all essentially heathens who will corrupt what they're doing, right? And he just repeats that over and over and over again, and he climbs to fame again as a builder within the party. When things collapse in Alberta for the Progressive Conservatives, they have also just collapsed for Stephen Harper federally, and Stephen Harper decides, or Jason Kenney decides to be the savior of the party in Alberta, comes to opposition, does the same thing, identifies a group of enemies, public servants, environmental groups, federal liberals, and blames them for all of Alberta's woes, and starts repeating these same conservative talking points over and over again. Eventually, it leads to him uniting the parties. When he gets into government, does the exact same thing as Premier. And at this point, it's a well-established tradition that, Ralph Klein used to say all the time, politicians shouldn't lead. Politicians should be the people standing around looking for a parade and jumping in front of it. They should follow. By this time, Kenney had built up a level of arrogance and a belief that he was right. And he felt that if he just kept repeating the points over and over again, as he had at the Taxpayers Federation, Albertans would fall into line. They didn't. The pandemic hits. He keeps repeating the point about freedom, about liberty, about personal responsibility. More and more Albertans, including many of the progressive conservative Albertans that started to get him elected, start falling off. By the time he has no choice, when Alberta's got the highest infection rate, the highest number of deaths, highest number of people in the hospital because of COVID, he realizes that he has to shift at the last minute. He has no choice. And when he shifts, he loses the far right base of the party. And that's what brings him down, the fact that over the course of the pandemic, he lost the moderate conservatives and he lost the far right. And that's ultimately his undoing. That leading with arrogance, not understanding the difference between an influencer and a political leader, and refusing to read the room.
Interesting. Let's move on to Danielle Smith, who seems to be even further to the right than Jason Kenney, a kind of right-wing libertarian who you describe in your book as a serial lobbyist, and a media personality with a kind of shaky grasp of facts, whose, as you also write, chief ability seems that of convincing others of her abilities.
Yeah, exactly. And she was also a rising star when she first started. It's important to remember that Danielle Smith and the Wild Rose Party were created by Alberta's oil industry. After Ed Stelmach and the Conservatives review royalties and actually increase them a little bit, right? The oil industry, as a protest sign against the Conservatives, creates the Conservative Party and puts this very articulate young woman at the leadership of it, because she's had experience in conservative circles and in the far right of the Conservative Party. This is somebody who comes up, she did an internship with Alberta Report, which was Byfield's far-right rag for years. She did an internship with the Fraser Institute. She got a placement as a far-right columnist and editorial board member at the Calgary Herald. She scabbed on the picket line that was at the Herald and actually wrote scathing articles about the unionized journalists at the Herald. She went on to be a shock jock on talk radio. She was most recently a lobbyist for the Alberta Enterprise Group. So this is what she's done. Another one who's very good with words, very good with language, but always toying with that far right extreme element. Unlike Kenney, she doesn't have that same religious tone to her talking, but very much far right libertarian ideals. When it becomes clear that the reason that Kenney lost was because he lost that far right, she all of a sudden entered the race because she knows how to bring that far right in. She knows how to play to that far right. And then her challenge was to try and find a way to bring enough of that moderate right back into the fold, which she developed a good plan to do it. The fact is, the challenge for her was that after 20 years of saying the most ridiculous things in print and on radio, it was very hard for her to pretend that she didn't own those beliefs about private healthcare, about education, about paying for schools, about private schools, right? About immigration, about all of these things. It became very difficult for her to disown those comments. So that's where she is right now too, and that's her challenge today.
Tell us a little bit about how she has governed for the last year or so.
She has walked a very fine line between not upsetting or disappointing that far right, like trying to keep them very close and playing footy with her. She launched the Alberta Sovereignty Act, which would assert our powers against the very aggressive Ottawa, in her words. She's talked about introducing an Alberta pension plan and pulling out of CPP. She's toyed with developing our own police force. She promised when she was running for the leadership that she would give amnesty, discovered she couldn't, tried anyways, and in the middle of the campaign, received a ruling from the ethics officer saying she'd violated conflict of interest laws because of her efforts to provide amnesty to people who set up at the Coots border and called for revolution in Alberta. So she's played footsie with those folks, while at the same time bringing out the biggest spending budget in Alberta's history. She just threw money at everything you can imagine, right? She was seen to be weak on healthcare, so she just threw money at healthcare. She issued a tax cut, introduced a new tax rate for anybody for the first $60,000 of income, now only have to pay 8%. So she's tried really hard to play both sides of that spectrum to keep both sides happy.
Let me ask you about the kind of gaffe-prone campaign that we've seen where almost on the daily, scandals from her past, scandalous things that she said from her past have been dredged up. And let me play you a quick little video, an ad that was actually put together by the NDP. Let's play that and then get your take on it.
Pay to see a doctor, fundraise for your health care, fire the RCMP, gamble your CPP, and more and more. When someone tells you who they are, you believe them, especially if they tell you over.
A regular checkup to your doctor? Does that really have to be something that is covered 100% by government?
And over.
Get your employer to put money in, raise money to put money in, get family members to donate money in.
And over.
I assure you, I have asked them that almost weekly. You just leave this with me.
And over.
There'll be no more floor crossings. This afternoon, I tendered my resignation and notified the Speaker that 9 members of the Wild Rose Caucus, including myself, will be joining the government caucus.
And over.
Everything that built up before you got to stage 4 in that diagnosis, that's completely within your control.
And over again.
I'm not wearing a poppy, but they ruined it for me.
This is Danielle Smith. Can you trust her?
Ricardo, what do you make of this trend, and will it actually have an impact on this election?
I think it has had an impact. We're looking at quite potentially the closest seat results in Alberta's history in any election, right? So it's the closest race we've ever seen for government. It has left the fact that the NDP has focused so hard on calling out this very radical nature of Danielle Smith, has left a bunch of moderate conservatives, the old progressive conservatives, kind of wandering around, not really sure what to do, right? They don't like Danielle Smith. They don't like this very radical element called Take Back Alberta that has taken control of that party and that seems very well positioned, including within the last premier's office, to put a lot of their ideas into practice. They're not sure that they're going to vote UCP. They're not sure they can be convinced to vote New Democrat and may just stay home, right? But the idea of targeting that radical element seems to have garnered some success in terms of the numbers for the NDP.
Let's talk a bit more about this, because it does seem to be both a strategy that the NDP has used in this election and also part of a longer term rightward shift. That in an article for The Breach, actually, that you wrote a few months ago or last month, you wrote about how, especially since forming government in 2015, the NDP has tracked right. And let me play you another clip. This is from Rachel Notley on the campaign trail, pitching herself to conservative voters, as a more safe, or lending the vote is how she describes it. Let's play that clip.
Then one man from Fort McLeod quietly smiled as he passed me a handwritten note that said, "I have voted conservative my entire life, but this time I'm voting NDP." Folks, every day more and more conservatives are actually realizing that their basic Alberta values are not represented in Danielle Smith's UCP. And some of those folks, as a result, are telling us they're going to lend us their vote. And to be honest, I don't mind that at all. Because, but no, seriously, because to me, no one's vote is something that anyone is entitled to simply because of one party's colors.
Ricardo, tell me, how did we get to this point where this seems to be the overweening strategy of the Alberta NDP?
It's electoral calculation, right? Alberta has become essentially a two-party state. And the math shows, and we'll likely see this tonight, very, very difficult for a New Democrat government to win in the face of a united right.
Yeah.
So the approach of tracking right is trying to broaden the tent and trying to play to that kind of what I've been calling the homeless, moderate conservative vote. So it comes about as an electoral strategy. My concern is not with the strategy itself. I mean, ultimately, there is a responsibility for civil society to actually create the ground for politicians to step into. And in many ways in Alberta, we as civil society have failed to do that. But my concern is with the fact that although I can understand the rightward tracking for electoral purposes, the strategy of simply focusing on attacking Danielle Smith rather than presenting a bit more of a coherent vision and pushing some of the elements that have actually worked for New Democrats in Alberta before, I think was a mistake, because it kind of demonstrated a lack of any real vision beyond we're not as bad as Danielle Smith. So, for example, focusing a bit more energy on, maybe without using the language, but on ideas of an energy transition, of building a sustainable alternative energy future for Canada. The idea of having an actual comprehensive long-term healthcare strategy that focuses as much on social determinants of health as it does on emergent health, of looking at taxation and revenue options, right? Like, there's so much there that would be appealing to that soft conservative vote that wasn't done. And instead, the focus became almost exclusively to say, we're almost as conservative as the UCP, so trust us. And I think presenting a coherent progressive vision would have gone a lot further than just doing the Danielle Smith attacks.
That's insightful, Ricardo. Super appreciate you joining us. We're going to have to leave it there, but later tonight, we'll have you back on again to check in about the results and give us your analysis about the implications.
Sounds good. Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Ricardo. That was Ricardo Acuna, the executive director of the Parkland Institute and the co-editor of a new anthology, Anger and Angst, Jason Kenney's Legacy and Alberta's Right. Hey, Addy.
Hey.
Why don't you tell me a bit about the other parties? We've heard now about the UCP and about the Alberta NDP. What do you make of the other parties in this race? Do they even have a chance of getting on the leaderboard or on the board? What's your sense?
Yeah, I mean, that was such a fascinating conversation. Ricardo's insight into this stuff is always really interesting, and he made a really good point about this being we're sort of in a two-party reality now. I do want to touch very quickly on something that he noted, which was Danielle Smith having interned at the Alberta Report, which many of our viewers might remember in the 2012 election. It was widely called the Lake of Fire election because of an MLA or a candidate who had written a blog post about gay people burning in a lake of fire. And Danielle Smith stood by that candidate, and she stood by many other candidates, including John Carpe, who some of our viewers will remember runs the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedom and has been at the center of a lot of anti-vaccine stuff. Has made a career out of fighting against the right to choice, taking universities to task over taking university to task when they disallow abortion as a genocide posters on campus and so on. Well, one of those candidates that election was Link Byfield, and Link Byfield is the same Byfield family that ran that rag, the Alberta Report rag, and I think folks will be surprised to learn a couple things if they don't know this already. But there's a magazine that gets a lot of airtime these days, the Western Standard magazine. Martin, you've probably seen some of their stuff. That's actually the Alberta Report reborn. That's Ezra Levant started the Western Standard magazine as in a way to sort of reinvent the Alberta Report, and now we actually have Link Byfield's brother running the UCP campaign in Edmonton, Vince Byfield, and so I think Vincent Byfield, I think is his name. It's the far right social conservatism that kind of plagued Danielle Smith's circles, I think is still very much present, and I think those are some really good points that Ricardo brought up. Well, talking about going to the other parties, look, the other parties are a bit of a non-factor at this point. The Liberal leader is running in his name is John Roggeveen. He's running in Calgary Lougheed. It's a firm UCP hold. I think it's important. It'd be interesting for some political watchers to note that the Liberal Party, of course, was led by Rod Sherman, who many will remember was actually initially a PC MLA. He's an interesting political figure. He got elected as a progressive conservative, then ran and became the Liberal leader after like a series of really weird things around wait times in emergency rooms. He claimed he had all this evidence that there was skipping the line happening by people connected to the PCs, and was unable to provide proof. But then he ran and won the Liberal leadership anyway. And after he won the Liberal leadership, he actually eventually decided to run for the UCP leadership, and was disqualified because he registered too late. But instead, he's running as a UCP candidate now in Edmonton Whitemud, taking on NDP incumbent Rocky Pancholi. So the Liberal Party is all over the place. I think there's the Alberta Party is the other kind of Liberal Party. It's led by Barry Morishita, who's the former mayor of Brooks, Alberta. He's running in Brooks Medicine Hat, and he's taking on none other than Danielle Smith herself. So there's not a whole lot of chance that Barry is going to find his way into the legislature this election. And then there's the Green Party, led by Jordan Wilkie, who's running in an Edmonton riding. Again, back to Edmonton. The NDP is really focused on trying to keep Edmonton. Rutherford is the riding that Jordan Wilkie is running in, and that's pretty well considered a strong NDP riding. Jody Calahoo Stonehouse is the NDP candidate in that riding. A quick note about the Green Party too is that the Green Party actually was dissolved a little while ago, before the 2012 election, and then had to run as the Evergreen Party because they just never got around to registering in time. And I mean, it's Alberta politics. There's never a dull moment. There's also an infamous politician named Joe Anglin who was once the leader of the Green Party, who sat as a PCMLA and was the Green Party leader, was the guy that actually presided over the dissolution of the party. Then went on and became a Wild Rose MLA and then ran for the Alberta Party. So these parties, these other smaller parties, are kind of all over the place. So I'd say they're a bit of a non-issue, a bit of a non-factor rather. I don't think we're expecting to see any of them gain any seats. Like Ricardo said, it's a bit of a two-party situation at this point.
So we have them on the ticker, but it's mostly a concession just to the aesthetic palette on the screen to have. That's right. There. Thanks for that overview.
So Barton, maybe I'll go into. I see that we have Romy here with us, and polls are closed now, and I think we're going to see some numbers come in. But perhaps we can jump right into our conversation with Romy.
Hey folks, how's it going?
Hey Romy, thanks for joining us. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. Well, Romy, listen, really glad to have you here, folks. Romy Garrido, longtime Calgary resident, campaigner, political activist. Well, listen, Romy, you're calling in from Battlefield, Calgary.
That's right.
It's everywhere. Everybody's talking about. The pathway to victory is in Calgary. If the NDP loses Calgary, they lose the election. Well, they had 14 out of 25 seats in Calgary in 2015. Now they have 3. So fill us in as to what's going on. Why is Calgary so important?
Well, in 2019, the NDP was really busy being government. And so they were a NUMI government. They were focusing on making sure that they actually ran a term that wasn't a total disaster, to be honest, because they just had a lot of paper candidates that got elected that weren't expecting to get elected. Total surprise in 2015 with the Orange Wave. So by 2019, I think they had hit their stride, but they were also trying to balance that with trying to get elected again and thinking about the campaign. So I was involved back then just for a short period, just trying to do, typical campaign activities, GOTV and volunteer coordination. And I'll tell you that Calgary was really grim. The resources were slim, and the focus from the NDP on Calgary just came a little too late. They had short staffing throughout their term in Calgary. They were really focused on Edmonton and province-wide. But when it came to Calgary, they realized too late that was going to be the battleground. And so I think the result would have been inevitable anyway. It seemed like it was written, that they were going to lose. That was just like the general feeling. But could they have done a bit better at that point in Calgary if they had focused more resources there and done more of that on the ground organizing? Yeah, absolutely. So I think the tides have turned a little bit. They had that realization, they learned their lesson, and that's evident because you've noticed Rachel Notley has spent a lot more time in Calgary. She even had a photo op voting in Calgary at the Calgary Public Library. They moved their headquarters to Calgary.
Well, let me jump in there for a second, Romy. Yeah. I remember that back during that time there was I think some folks might say to you, well, that sounds a little bit harsh, Romy, because the party did put a lot of effort into Calgary. There was the Calgary headquarters that I think was at some point staffed by Chris O'Halloran and I think Bob Hawksworth was also at the Calgary headquarters in the first half of the 2015 mandate. And then he ran in the by-election that Prasad Panda won. What would you say based on all of this that they're trying to do differently really this time and than they did in 2019?
Well, so I would wager that if you talk to those folks, they would also admit that, if things felt a little lonely, like, yes, there were staff in Calgary, no doubt. But the question is, was there enough? Were they able to compete, or were they able to balance out those sort of competing interests of being in government and then also trying to run a campaign, as a first time government and kind of an unseen government in Alberta? So I think what's different this time is that they were in opposition. position. It's a lot easier to lead and to critique from that point of view. And then as well, there was a pandemic. There's just a lot of events that took place that put them in a bit of a stronger position this time around. But as Ricardo was talking about, it hasn't exactly been a super notable election in terms of their promises and their vision to Calgarians and Albertans at large. So things have changed. They've done a lot more groundwork. One thing I would say is that, for those ridings that have been polling in Calgary, more neck and neck, right? Where maybe some conservative pundits might say things like, how's it possible that in a suburban riding like Calgary Edgemont, the NDP even has a chance? Well, it's because they've done a lot of ground game. Like, these candidates have been knocking doors, talking to people one-on-one for 4 years now. And so I say, if the NDP has any chance this election, it's not necessarily because of the vision that they've put out or lack thereof. It's because their candidates in the local campaigns have done all the groundwork. And surprise, surprise to all my community organizers out there, like, one-on-one conversations, talking to people, seeing the whites of their eyes, trying to change hearts and minds, like, it works. It really works when you do that one-on-one work.
That's really good. I mean, it's interesting for sure. I think folks know that some of the ridings that the NDP has now, of course, are kind of right in the middle of town. There's whether it's McCall, Mountain View, or Buffalo, but you're right. You're absolutely right. Like, a lot of the target ridings are outside. I mean, there's Northeast, there's Falcon Ridge. Folks, the NDP is really targeting some Calgary ridings that I think folks would have said, "What are you doing?" So I mean, it's one thing to have the ground game that you're talking about, that there's folks on the ground doing the door knocking, doing the organizing, that the candidates are doing their part. But part of election campaigning is also the sort of the comm strategy. And what are you selling, really? So what is the NDP selling to the Calgary voter, Romy?
Oof. I have a tough time answering this one, because I honestly, I have a hard time, saying what they're selling just off the top of my head. I think, as somebody who, is kind of hyper engaged in paying attention, yeah, I can say that they've promised to build the rest of the Green Line. They're going to largely reverse a lot of the regressive policies and implementations from the UCP. But in terms of anything that really got me excited to go out to the polls, not a whole lot. I think it's not a secret. I mean, they've been admitting it themselves that they've been trying to court kind of moderate conservative voters in Calgary. They, this can be a bit of like a larger discussion, but it's a reality that a strong NDP base in Alberta is not enough for them to make government. Right. So they read the cards on a short timeline, and to win the 2023 election, they had to go out and find more voters. And on a short-term thinking timeline, the only type of voter that they could find is like a swayable conservative. So the communications that they've been putting out there has been really tame. It's been, I mean, even economist Trevor Toombs said that, the economic platform between the NDP and the UCP is not actually that different. So that's kind of an indictment as to where they're at right now. I think Ricardo really went into that in the previous discussion that you had. So their strategy just has been very short-term thinking, one that I think is going to possibly get them close to winning this election, which is why the polls have been showing them neck and neck. But in terms of, long-term sustainability, a viable party with a vision that's actually building that base of people that are going to want to come out and vote NDP over and over again, this is not that strategy. That communications is not the type that's actually going to make them the type of party that will see not just 2023 win, but the election after, and the election after, and the election after that.
Yeah, that's interesting, because there's that tension between folks who they're calculating will vote for them anyway, no matter what. These folks are going to vote for the NDP. There's no other home for these voters, and it's really getting those new voters to vote NDP. And in 2019, we talked about this at the top of the show, that the number of voters that the NDP got in 2019 wasn't a whole lot different from the number of voters they had in 2015. but the voter turnout was extremely high, and all of those new voters pretty much seem to go to the UCP. And so there's clearly, some calculation being made that, yeah, absolutely, we have to make sure that we get those folks. Otherwise, we're not gonna win. And I think they've succeeded to a certain extent. There's the former cabinet ministers, PC cabinet ministers, were coming out, endorsing the NDP. I think in 2015, if I remember correctly, Ralph Klein's daughter endorsed the NDP in that election. But the other thing, of course, is not only is all of that happening, but to your point that that maybe this calculation is actually at the expense of future success, is really an interesting one, and I think folks are everybody will have an opinion on whether this is the right or the wrong way to go, and I'm sure we could talk about that forever. So I do want to change directions a little bit, and ask you about the kind of the for lack of a better word, the weirdos in the election. So there's been a lot of kind of spin-off conservative parties. There have been the folks who've actually taken over the UCP board in some way, the Take Back Alberta folks and so on. What are you here? What can you tell us about that? And I actually see the tickers changing, so we'll take a look at what's going on over there as well. But yeah, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So I do audience engagement for Press Progress, actually, fellow investigative news outlet as well. And so our journalists were some of the ones that were covering and watching closely some of the activities of this third party advertiser, Take Back Alberta, or TBA. And Take Back Alberta is it's run by David Parker, who is kind of a long time conservative sort of staffer and insider, having worked for Harper and just a number of big names. And he takes credit in a way for actually getting Jason Kenney out of the way when it became clear that Jason Kenney, as Ricardo was talking about, wasn't quite catering to the more far right wing of the party. And so Take Back Alberta has really done a lot of on the ground organizing. You could even say that they did entryism into the UCP by taking over a lot of the bureaucratic boards and just a lot of like the institutional side of the party, really organizing folks to ensure that they had power and influence, so that Danielle Smith was catering to this kind of voter base of people. So we can call them weirdos, we can call them the extreme right, but what I'd say is that their message is catering to a sort of voter base that I think is being ignored. Maybe not even a voter base, but just historically a group of people that have been disenfranchised, that maybe are anti-elite and anti-establishment. And we're seeing this at the federal level. I think the Breach has covered really excellently a lot of like Pierre Poilievre's signaling to that sort of group of people. But there's a potential audience there that's angry, and I think they're harnessing a lot of that anger to be able to mobilize and to get people impassioned about political issues. Unfortunately, it goes hand in hand with some really, really regressive views that have been covered extensively by mainstream media, including women taking too much attention to their careers rather than their children, or there's kind of a lot of like Christian old school values, but I think at the core there is a mobilization of working class disenfranchised people in Alberta, and I think that's really key for the NDP to pay attention to in the long term, that Conservatives are signaling to that sort of base, which I would say the NDP vision historically should be catering a solution to that type of person, right? Somebody who's been burned by the system, someone who has lost trust in politicians, in figures of authority. The NDP vision of equalizing the playing field, of making a just economy and increasing your quality of life through strong public services. That's the answer for a lot of those folks. And unfortunately, they're starting to find it within the Conservative base.
I think that's really on point, Romy. I mean, it's the issue of folks who are angry. They should be angry. They should feel pissed off. The problem is they're angry and pissed off at the wrong people. And we got to make sure that we're at the. I think Ricardo put it really well, that civil society has a responsibility to create the conditions for the success of that kind of a bold vision for a political party to carry that banner. And we do have to have a hard look at ourselves as the left. Have we succeeded in creating that kind of that political space for political parties to be able to do that and run with those ideas? Really interesting insights, really great commentary. Thank you, Romy. Battleground Calgary. Everybody's talking about that. So let's see how that plays out. So we'll leave it there for now, Romy. Thanks so much for coming on.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Well, folks, that was Romy Garrido, a longtime campaigner and activist in Calgary, explaining how the city is going to be decisive in this election. Really insightful and interesting comments. So, Martin, how are you doing? What are your thoughts on what Romy had to say? Martin, you're muted.
My apologies. Yeah, first off, a huge shout out to Press Progress, where Romy works. They have been doing just superlative investigative journalism, both about Take Back Alberta as well as Danielle Smith, just outdoing the mainstream media when it comes to investigating the right in Alberta. So kudos to them, and they've broken several really important stories. So yeah, I think she made a number of really great points. Really just building off of what Ricardo was saying earlier, that we really haven't seen a kind of aggressively, boldly progressive, positive agenda from the Alberta NDP in this election. And I think it's something that's plagued the NDP both provincially and federally in recent years. I can think of something that Janet Brown, who's a well-known pollster in Alberta, said recently, where she said that by focusing so much on Danielle Smith, the NDP have certainly given people a reason to doubt her and her competence and her politics, but they haven't really done enough to give an affirmative reason to vote for the NDP. And so while they have, made a play for these moderate conservatives, there's really a question that we will see an answer to tonight about how much they have actually mobilized their base, and also a potential base of many non-voters, many working class people who often don't feel motivated to vote because they're not really genuinely hearing, a substantive, positive vision. To me, it's just striking when an apolitical pollster understands this and understands political campaigning better than the leader of the Alberta NDP, then a party is in trouble.
Well, does this remind you of what I wanted to ask you? Does this remind you of conversations in the 2015 federal election when there was the single-minded focus on stopping Harper? Everything was stop Harper, stop Harper, stop Harper, and I feel like some ink was spilled on the question of, well, should the NDP, the federal NDP in that case, have done more to give people a reason to vote for them rather than against Harper? And is that kind of a parallel you're seeing here? Is that what you're getting at?
I mean, I think we're seeing it in successive elections. We certainly saw it, as you say, in 2015 when, Justin Trudeau absolutely ate the lunch of the NDP. He was the one who presented himself as a, anti-establishment, bold, progressive leader. Of course, he was none of those things, but he did a very compelling job at selling himself as that. And then we've seen it again most recently, I think, in the Ontario election, when the NDP again presented themselves, as uber critics of Doug Ford, but they didn't really present a compelling alternative vision. And so you saw again Doug Ford being able to kind of ride a faux populist politics to victory. So, I mean, we'll see what we'll see if this strategy works. I'm personally doubtful, but I'm happy to eat crow if the NDP just pulls it off tonight. We'll see.
Oh, that's great. Well, it looks like some numbers are coming in, Martin. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, yeah. So we've had a few numbers in, but at this point, we're talking really just about like a dozen, 2 dozen, maybe 100 votes in different ridings. So while the UCP is up, it's a little too early to really be able to, predict any kind of set trends. So we'll have to wait a little bit more before we can. So people shouldn't get, if NDP partisans out there, they shouldn't be worried yet.
Shouldn't be worried yet. Well, that's great. Well, hopefully everybody calms down a bit. I will leave this to you, and so you can chat with our next guest.
Great. Is Emma Jackson here? Amazing. Welcome, Emma.
Yes. Hi. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Wonderful to have you. So Emma is a organizer with Climate Justice Edmonton and 350 Canada. She's written for The Breach, including one of our most read articles ever, a really insightful piece on what the left can learn from the organizing successes of the so-called Freedom Convoy, a convoy that, of course, has its roots in far-right Albertan politics. She's joining us from Edmonton, apparently from a brewery, which is probably a wise move, depending on how this night goes. Emma, let me ask you, the election has unfolded with an eerie and frightening backdrop, an unprecedented spring of wildfires that have blazed across the province. I want to start by playing a clip of what it was like just 2 weeks ago.
The dense smoke that shrouded northern Alberta now sits heavy over Calgary.
It's a real hazard.
And in the noses and throats of the people who live there.
I left my windows open last night, and of course my apartment is now full of smoke, so it's not nice.
Hundreds of kilometers north, closer to the source of some of that smoke, Dave Banman's restaurant prepares to feed firefighters and evacuees.
I wanted to cry, like really. It breaks my heart to see them displaced like that, and not knowing if they're going to be able to go home.
High Level has been inundated with fire evacuees from the east, the west, and now even the north.
I've never, ever experienced this before, ever. I mean, we have fires all around us. I mean, all of Alberta is burning, and it's not a good thing. We need some rain, and we need it bad.
Emma, why don't you tell us about what it was like in Edmonton watching the sky turn orange?
Yeah, so in the span of, a 28-day election or however long it's been, I think for those of us who live in the major cities of Calgary and Edmonton, there was about 4 days of that election where, I couldn't go outside. So if you went outside for as much as 10 minutes, that was about equivalent to smoking, 7 cigarettes in that amount of time. I think for all of us, it weighed really heavy to be experiencing that so much, to watch, First Nations communities in particular, Métis communities being absolutely devastated by these fires. Friends, the family of friends having to evacuate from one community, being sent to another community, and then being under threat of another evacuation order, having to literally kind of outchase these fires that were blazing across the province. And at the same time, while all of this was unfolding, we didn't have really any mention whatsoever about the climate crisis. There was hardly anything that was said, not even, I think, a tweet by Rachel Notley to say, climate change is real, which at this point is the absolute bare minimum that we should be able to expect from our politicians. So it's been, I would say, like incredibly disheartening to watch this unfold and to see it as like, this is a major opportunity, and not to say like, let's leverage this crisis, but I think the climate crisis is very real for Albertans. We know that the vast majority of people, living in Alberta understand the reality of climate change, accept the fact that it's here, or it's an emergency, it's about to become an emergency. And it really felt like just being absolutely sort of dismissed. You wake up and your entire apartment, like that man said, just smells like smoke, and you're like, how are we not talking about this?
In this piece that you wrote for us, you wrote that there couldn't actually be a better moment to reckon with the roots of the emergency. Austerity and climate change is, as you put it. How is it that in a moment like that, it didn't become a climate election?
Yeah, I mean, I think the NDP, honestly, I think they were really scared, and I think they underestimated the average Albertan. And I think it was a slap in the face in a lot of ways to just be like, oh, we can't talk about the climate crisis. Calgarians won't vote for us if we do. And I think that there was a way to do that. I think, we know that Calgary elected Jyoti Gondak, who brought in a climate emergency as her first, piece of legislation as mayor. And so it was kind of consistently underestimating people. I mean, I would also say, like, that is the work of social movements. That is the work of the left. There's a lot of work clearly to do in order to build the capacity and really like build that political education to make space to talk about climate change and to force them to do so. And at the same time, like you said, I think it was an incredibly sort of missed opportunity where, this election didn't have to be the sort of climate first election by any means. But I think what other sort of panelists have said was this was a major opportunity for the NDP to put forward a bold, compelling vision of the future of Alberta and what its economy could look like. And I think part of that should have been nested within the frame of, we know that the world is moving beyond oil and gas. We can't keep our head in the sands. Oil and gas companies are making record profits right now. And at the same time, they're paying off their shareholders. They are laying off their workforce. They're refusing to pay their lowest paid employees, very meager wage increases. And so to me, that's the frame is how are we connecting the cost of living crisis to a future economy that is rooted in climate action, diversifying our economy, creating jobs. And yeah, you're right. Like we really didn't see that. And I think it was because the NDP, they played it safe. This entire election, they played it safe. And I think a lot of Calgarians would have been compelled by them going to the doors and being like, you're living under smoke. You haven't been able to go outside in a week. We are unprepared. We are unprepared for the climate crisis, in large part because of UCP cuts, because of UCP austerity. And at the same time, we promise that we are going to invest in those frontline services, that frontline response that is necessary, and we can create thousands of good jobs in the process.
Let's drill down a bit more into what the NDP strategy has been. So you live in Edmonton. What's your sense of what has the campaign looked like in a place like Edmonton? I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting that you're talking to me where I am, where, there's a lot of people from the left, from the labor movement right now that are in this bar that I'm in. And the overriding feeling for many of us is, they sacrificed us, they wrote us off. They really were like, we're going to placate to the center. We have to go conservative light in order to chase those conservative sort of undecided voters who, are disenchanted with Danielle Smith, who don't trust in her leadership. And we're going to placate to them. And we're really going to write you off and just take for granted the fact that, you're going to vote for us. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm in a bar where major labor leaders have admitted that they, voted for the Green Party because it was the most socialist platform that existed. And I think what they did and the way that I would frame this is I think it's not dissimilar to me. Election strategy is not dissimilar to social movement strategy. And I think with that, you really need to energize your base and you need to isolate your opposition in order to be able to move that middle. I think what Rachel Notley has done has in a lot of ways been, her sort of Hillary Clinton moment of we're just going to placate to the middle as much as possible. And that's what we're going to prioritize. And, there are people here in Edmonton, myself included, who had you given me a compelling vision of what the future of Alberta could look like. I'm not saying the most radical, socialist vision that I would love to see, but had you moved the needle, there are people in Edmonton who would have been driving back and forth, who would have been, on the bus to Calgary, who would have door knocked on hundreds of doors, and really been energized to try to win these battleground ridings and put in the time and effort to do that. And I think ultimately, there were key moments throughout this election where I said to myself, like, I really tried. Like, I tried to push myself to be like, this is a major election. Danielle Smith is like incredibly dangerous, and I cannot get out of bed and knock on doors for a party that is willing to boast about, helping to get TMX approved during a climate crisis, a party that is boasting about having the lowest corporate tax rate in the country. And so I really do think that in Edmonton, a lot of us really dragged ourselves to the polls. I saw there's like a small ice cream shop in Edmonton that was like, we'll give you free ice cream if you go and vote. And I was like, that might be the thing that does it for me. That and getting, a plastic laminated health card finally. But I think it's really taken a lot for us to get ourselves even out to the polls.
I mean, I'm struck how the right in Alberta, regardless of what the Alberta NDP puts forward, is going to label them as socialists, out to destroy the oil industry. So if they're going to call them that, regardless of what they put forward, they might as well give us a little bit of socialism. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And they seem to think that that there's a way to placate right-wing critics, an overwhelmingly right-wing media. Every single newspaper in Alberta is owned by the right-wing Post media chain. You'd think that if they're going to get labeled that anyway, they might as well be a little bit more bold.
Yeah. And I would say, I think the thing that kills me too is that the party apparatus is like so dictated by polling, and they're like, well, healthcare, people care about healthcare, so we need to do that. But it's like, even polling will consistently show you that Albertans are like way more ready for climate action if it's tied to making the rich pay. Like, there is such deep populist sentiment in this province, and it is absurd that it's like you didn't even try to pull at it at all, and you gave us the most lukewarm campaign ever. It really was just like deeply uninspiring. And I think to know that like 1 in 5 Albertans are accessing food banks right now, and to not pulling at that and making clear that that is a problem, and that the health of our economy actually shouldn't be dictated on corporate profit. You're right. It's like, they're going to cast us as socialists anyways, like, feed into that,
Yeah, I know. I'm struck that when you mentioned that Albertans regularly poll to the left of the positions the Alberta NDP takes. I can just think of a poll that was done as far back as 2005, and they polled Albertans on whether they would support nationalizing, moving into public ownership, the oil industry. And even then, without a single politician advocating for such a thing, a third of Albertans were supportive of that idea. So imagine if, you had an NDP, campaigning, advocating for what are traditionally social democratic politics. I think you would see pretty quickly shifts in voter intentions that unfortunately we're not seeing now. You mentioned the power of the oil industry. I want to ask you a bit more about that because, they obviously have an incredible grip over the province's politics. Can you talk a little bit about how they've, managed to entangle themselves in communities and make it more difficult to imagine a future without them?
Yeah, I would say definitely the oil and gas industry has so concretely constrained the political imagination in this province. I think there are so many communities, I would probably include Calgary amongst them, but also those that are, more rural and resource dependent, that really kind of rely on the sort of benevolence of the oil and gas industry in order to pay for social programs. I spent a lot of time going back and forth to Fort McMurray, for example, and their entire rec center is, I think it's the Syncrude Rec Center, and the pool is the Shell pool, and the sort of whole tiled ground is the Shell logo. And so it's incredibly nefarious the way that the oil and gas industry has infiltrated everyday life in this province. And I think it's really easy, I come from outside of Alberta. I've lived here for about 7 years, but it's really easy for people outside of Alberta to be like, wow, Albertans are brainwashed, or, to really look down on Albertans in some ways. And it's like, it has been set up in that way over decades, that the state has really pulled back and allowed corporate infiltration of everyday life in a way that, you can't blame people when it means, their kid's high school gets a new auditorium because of the generosity, so to speak, of the oil and gas industry. But again, I think that there's like such a critical moment to be able to say they are making record profits. They're not investing in our communities right now. They're paying off their shareholders. And if anything, now is the time where we can't sit back. We can't trust them. And I think that distrust is starting to build even in rural regions. So yeah, it's incredibly frustrating that the Alberta NDP didn't use that.
Yeah, there's just so much money there. I mean, the tens, if not hundreds of $billions of profit by the oil industry in Canada and across the world. I mean, the money is there for the taking. Not as a, as you put it, not as a matter of generosity, but as a matter of justice, if we can make the demand politically. We're looking at the polls now, and the outlets haven't called it yet, but the UCP is certainly already above that magic number of 44, which is what they need for majority. So it's a sizable lead. If it is indeed, in fact, a UCP majority, I'm curious, how do you think movements should be responding if they're looking at 4 years of Danielle Smith?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think, to be honest, and just in case something radically shifts, I don't think that the response is any different really either way. Like, I think that this moment demands that movements go on the offensive regardless of who forms government in this province. We haven't been given nearly enough of what we deserve, of what working people in this province deserve. I think should the UCP be elected, which is what I am predicting, what I have been predicting since the very beginning of this, I think there's a real opportunity here for the left to form broad-based coalitions based on key issues that people are most concerned about. I would say healthcare and education being amongst the sort of top issues. I think that Labor absolutely needs to play a critical role in this. They can't sit in the bush. They are likely to be really, under attack right away. But this is going to require organized resistance from all of us. It's about having those difficult conversations with our neighbors, with our friends, with whoever we have access to, our coworkers. And yeah, I think coming out really strong, not waiting until the first piece of legislation, the first attack that Danielle Smith drops, but really going on the offensive right away. I think what we've seen from Danielle Smith is really this like shock and awe politics. There's always something absurd, and with that, there's this temptation to really get like pulled back and forth constantly and to not have a clear vision of like where we are going and map it out. And I think what is needed right now is to say, okay, where are we trying to get to in 5 years, in 7 years, in 10 years, and working back from there and not letting them just sort of steer us to constantly being reactive to whatever attack they have going on.
I really appreciate that perspective, Emma. You mentioned conversations with your neighbors being a real important part of the organizing that has to be done. I want to leave this conversation on a hopeful note, though. That was definitely a invigorating analysis. In that Breach article, you describe having a run-in with a neighbor who worked as a Boilermaker in the oil industry, and how the exchange you had might actually be surprising to some of our listeners. Could you tell us about what happened?
Yeah, so this was one morning, probably about a year ago, when I was actually moving into the apartment that he was leaving. So I'm currently living in his apartment. Early one morning, he was giving me his phone number in order for me to tell them when I have his mail and so on and so forth. And he asked me what I did for work, which sometimes in Alberta, I'm like, I don't always want to talk about it. It, is polarized in some ways. But I told him that I work on climate change, and he was just like, he was so impressed, and he was like, oh my God, that's incredible, blah, 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 blah. And told me, that he was a Boilermaker, that he worked out in the refineries in Edmonton, and that he ultimately doesn't want to work in oil and gas anymore. He said, the money's good, everything about it is good, but the climate crisis has like really been hitting home. Specifically was talking about, in the summer of 2019, or it was a little bit later, maybe 2021, when there was really severe wildfires that were burning in BC, and having to just, live with the guilt in some ways, which is like, it's not in any way his fault, but living with guilt of feeling as though he was contributing to the crisis. And I think for me, that's one of many, many, many conversations that I've had, especially amongst young people who will come up to me and be like, I support climate action. I like really support what you're calling for. And I'm like scared to put my face to it. But I think so many people in this province are just like him. They're looking for a concrete plan. They want to know what jobs are going to be available to them. They want to know what their future can look like beyond oil and gas. And I think that the clock is ticking. The time has come, and these people really, really deeply deserve a plan and a vision that is just, that is equitable, that allows them to put food on the table and to not, be contributing or feeling any sort of personal guilt when these multi-billion-dollar corporations are ultimately the ones to blame.
Emma, thank you so much for pointing us to the possibilities that are there if we can seize them. That's a hopeful note to end on. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. I'll go grab Brad.
Take care. Addie.
Hey, great conversation there.
Yeah, Emma's great. Any updates about the polls?
Looking interesting. Lots of numbers coming in. Not seeing anything decisive yet. The kinds of numbers that are coming in are pretty low, so it's hard to call a lot of the seats. For the viewers, to give you a bit of an indication, you're seeing numbers go up on the ticker at the bottom of your screen for the UCP and for the NDP a little slower. But these are seats that are leading. We don't, I don't believe, have any seats called yet. With a significant enough number of polls reporting. So don't get carried away quite yet. There's still a little bit of ways to go. I think the numbers will keep coming in a little rapidly as the night goes on. But that's where we're at right now.
I'm struck by apparently what we're seeing is that the NDP is actually in the lead in total vote share, which would be, quite a striking departure from the last election. So that may not yet be reflected in the breakdown of the seats, but could still prove, quite hopeful for the NDP.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the total number of votes that we're seeing come in so far are kind of around 5,400 or so, according to CBC, with under 5,000 for the UCP. But of course, 5,000 is a total of 10,000 between the two parties at this point is a fraction of the total number of eligible voters. So yeah, definitely something to keep an eye on. The numbers seem to be coming in slower than expected, but certainly I'm expecting this to speed up over the next 30-40 minutes or so.
Well, I hope you've got some caffeine or some beverages to keep you going, because it might be a bit of a long night. Let me ask you, Addie, are there any particular ridings that you are kind of closely watching? Any particularly left-wing or progressive candidates you're keeping an eye on?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, Martin. I certainly think that there are some really interesting candidates to be looking for in the certainly in the NDP caucus, the NDP slated candidates who have some solid progressive credentials. The first one that comes to my mind is Rod Loyola, who many of our listeners and viewers will know very well. Rod Loyola has been a fixture in the Edmonton activist scene. He represents Edmonton Ellerslie, a member of the Chilean diaspora, came to Canada. His family escaped Pinochet's government. It was part of a rap hip hop group called the People's Poets before he got elected to the legislature. So Rod, of course, a really well-known activist in the Edmonton scene, somebody who comes to mind immediately. There is also among the incumbent MLAs who are running for re-election, Jasbir Dale from Edmonton as well, who is somebody who has been involved in kind of the South Asian progressive circles, member of a group of folks in the tradition of Raj Panu and Salim Qureshi and others in Edmonton who are also well known progressive South Asian leaders. Raj Panu, of course, many of our listeners and viewers will know, was a former leader of the Alberta NDP and represented Edmonton Strathcona before Rachel Notley represented Edmonton Strathcona. Dave Egan, also from Edmonton, a really well-known activist before going into politics, a former executive director of Friends of Medicare, a very crucial organization in the province that's fighting to protect public health care, now led, of course, by Chris Galloway, somebody that many of our viewers and listeners will know very well. Janice Urban, again in Edmonton, if we're staying in Edmonton, somebody who's got a really great following on social media, who's been really active human rights activist, especially for mental health, for harm reduction, for LGBT rights, and so on. Represents the riding that was held by Brian Mason, the former Alberta NDP leader. Somebody who every time I think of him, I think of him describing new leaders of the Conservative Party by saying that it's just a new coat of paint on the same old rusty tractor, and it always makes me chuckle. But not to be outdone, Calgary's got some interesting candidates as well. But the one that really stands out is that I want to highlight now in light of the conversation with Emma is Samir Kayande, who is a candidate who I think folks are really hopeful about in the NDP camp, but just recently got lambasted by Dave Staples, a Calgary, an Alberta columnist, because 2 years ago this candidate Samir wrote an article about how fossil fuels are going to have to go. And there was a whole column dedicated to how this was an out of touch comment with Alberta. So I think there are some really interesting candidates who are running. Brooks Archon-Paul, by the way, just to take a quick step back to Edmonton, somebody who finished law school here at Ottawa U, my alma mater, and Brooks also a really progressive and a new face for the Alberta NDP. So lots of really interesting folks to watch. Lots of social workers. Laurie Sigurdsson is running again for re-election. She was a cabinet minister. Peggy Wright, by the way, who is running in Edmonton Beverly Clairview, is a past Alberta NDP party president, longtime sort of background activist and organizer, somebody who has always been a fixture at protests, at events, at efforts to try and organize the community. So I think some really interesting folks who are running, lots of interesting faces and lots of interesting histories. You're muted again, Martin.
Absolute amateur streamer over here. My apologies. Thanks for taking us through that spin through progressive Alberta. Appreciate it. I think our next guest is here, I understand. Yeah, amazing. We're joined by Angela Look. You have graciously stepped in last minute to replace Crystal Lehman, who got sick tonight and had to pull out. Angel is an assistant professor in the School of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at York University and a member of the Big Stone Cree Nation in Treaty 8 in Alberta. She's also the co-author of The End of This World, which is a terrific new book about climate justice in these lands, published by Between the Lines. And she's joining us from Toronto. Welcome. It's great to have you on.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me, Martin. I'm glad to be here.
Thanks so much for making it. So our sense is that it looks probable that it might be a UCP government. Can you talk a little bit about how you think First Nations and Indigenous peoples would fare under a UCP government over 4 years?
Well, if we are getting a UCP government, it's not good news. This is the government under Danielle Smith, whose first act was the Sovereignty Act, which infringed on Indigenous sovereignty and treaty. And chiefs from Treaty 6, Treaty 7, and Treaty 8 all spoke against this act. The previous premier, Jason Kenney, his first act was the Critical Infrastructure Act, which violated the right to the freedom of association, which infringes on the rights of Indigenous people and also those in the labor movement and others to gather. And so it's not a good thing. It's kind of scary, actually. Indigenous nations never ceded their lands under treaty. And in our book, we talk about the need to restore treaty and restore Indigenous sovereignty if we're going to have a just transition of our economy away from fossil fuels. To the Treaty 6, 7, and 8 chiefs, this means less consultation and more resource extraction. And, a lot of Indigenous folks live in urban centers and will be directly impacted by healthcare cuts, by cuts to education, cuts to other social services. It's a bit upsetting to hear that the UCP will get in again. There's also been cuts to funding that supports fighting the forest fires that are happening in the north right now. So it's not good because, Indigenous folks, a lot of Indigenous folks live on reserve, but about half of Indigenous folks live in rural municipalities and in urban centers. And so we'll be very affected by cuts to public funding, especially because a lot of Indigenous folks are vulnerable, because of our colonial history and intergenerational traumas. We need access to healthcare, to mental health services, to hospitals, to childcare funding, to long-term care funding, better supports in our schools. So, this is not a good thing for regular Indigenous folks who just need access to public services. And it's not good for our leadership who are fighting to maintain our sovereignty and uphold treaty.
Thanks for that. Can we talk a little bit about the UCP's climate and environmental agenda? They released their climate plan during the election. It's entitled the Emissions Reduction and Energy Development, but it's also been kind of called a fake climate plan. Can you tell us what we should make of it?
Well, the Pathways Alliance and the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers seem to like it because it looks like this plan will just mean business as usual, maintaining the status quo. This plan is described as being aspirational. There's no set targets for reducing production or consumption of fossil fuels, which we know, it's the emissions that cause climate change. Alberta is responsible for 38% of emissions in the country. And so, we really should be keeping the oil in the ground. We should be finding other solutions for our energy futures. My understanding is that the plan relies on carbon capture and storage, which have not been proven to be real solutions. And actually, according to Environmental Defense, carbon capture is said to be both, unsafe and dangerous for marginalized communities, and will probably result in further environmental racism to Indigenous and racialized folks. And when I think about climate policy plans, the questions I ask, especially given that a lot of Alberta has been on fire, we've been dealing with floods in the past, we've been dealing with higher rates of asthma and COPD and eczema and allergies in Indigenous communities. Does this plan mean fewer heat waves? Does this plan mean fewer forest fires? Does this plan mean fewer floods? Well, if we're not reducing emissions, I think it means more forest fires, more floods, more natural disasters, more breaches of tailings ponds, which seep into our water systems. Does this plan mean cleaner air, water, and land for Indigenous people? Does it mean less environmental racism? I don't think it does. Does this plan do anything for First Nations and Métis communities dealing with environmental racism? Does this plan mean that Indigenous communities are going to have to evacuate less frequently? The forest fire season is getting longer and starting earlier every year. So I think this plan just means, if you think futuristically, more kind of apocalyptic, experiences, more red skies, less clean water. So I don't know if it's a real plan.
Well, thanks for laying out the grim truth and reality of it. I mean, I think we definitely need to grapple with it in order to fight it. So I appreciate you being so lucid about it. Can you talk about what it would take to move the conversation about Indigenous rights and environmental action in Alberta? What's your sense? Even if it is a UCP government, what are Indigenous rights movements and social movements to do?
I don't know. I was actually just thinking about that. I was thinking, if we get the most colonial capitalist government that infringes on our treaty and pollutes our water and air and, alienates us from our lands, does that mean that we're going to come together in solidarity? Does it mean we're going to actually do something? When the Sovereignty Act was released, I think that's one of the first times I've seen the chiefs of Treaty 6, 7, and 8 come together and have a press conference and make a statement. When the Critical Infrastructure Act came out under the Kenney government, that's the first time I've seen the labor movement, file a complaint in solidarity with Indigenous peoples who are also losing their right to protest and their freedom of association. So I don't know what it'll take. I don't know how much worse it can get. Another thing that the UCP government says that they're going to do is infuse more money into public safety and reducing crime, which actually means more police. So does that mean more Indigenous folks being criminalized? More Indigenous folks going to jail, when we should actually be investing in public resources to deal with intergenerational trauma. We shouldn't be putting more people in jail. We should be providing healthy, holistic solutions to community. So, yeah, I don't know. I think Alberta is I grew up in Alberta. I worked in the labor movement in Alberta. I raised my kids in Alberta for many years. It's a great place to be. There's great community. There's a large Indigenous population. There's a real sense of, like, when I'm back home, especially in my First Nations community, there's a real sense of belonging. So I really hope that, if we are going to get a UCP government, that really just gives us that extra push to come together and work together to deal with the climate crisis and trying to uphold treaty. I hope that answers your question. I kind of went on some tangents.
No, it does. And speaking of that, holistic, sustainable, and safe future, I'm curious to ask you, the book that you're a co-author of is called The End of This World. But the world we live in, the one in which a right-wing, oil-adulating, conspiracy-addled politician could rule potentially Alberta, that world seems kind of grimly resistant to not ending. But give us a sense of what that new world calling might look like, that world that we could, just transition to. Give us a sense of that.
Yeah, so in the book, we kind of lay out what a feminist decolonial just transition would look like, taking into the consideration of maintaining treaty, upholding Indigenous sovereignty, and dealing with these systems of oppression that Indigenous people find themselves dealing with on a day-to-day basis. So one of the things that we advocate in the book is restoring Indigenous care economies. I'm flipping through the book. And that's the chapter that I contributed to. By care economies, we mean centering the lives of children and future generations in our economies, valuing the paid and unpaid work that women and caregivers do, being respectful to the land and to each other, maintaining good relations with each other and our non-human relations. So that's what we mean by Indigenous care economies. But I think Indigenous care economies also fit very well with feminist discussions of care economies. And often, when we talk about feminist economies of care, what that looks like in policy is fighting for universal public services. So having access to well-funded, expanded healthcare. Like right now in Alberta, they're losing a lot of doctors. And it looks like under the UCP, a lot of basic health services and also special treatments will be privatized. And we know that private care, for example, long-term care facilities, which are private, provide worse care. They provide fewer hours of care. And actually, during the pandemic, more people died in private healthcare facilities than public facilities. Under a caring economy, we would have access to universal education from, kindergarten, elementary to high school and university, so that workers can have greater agency in the choices they make in school and work. which could lead to decent work and access to better wages, better working conditions, if you allow people to access education, universal childcare and elder care. We know that research done by labor economists shows that when you invest in affordable, accessible, universal childcare, that more women are able to participate in the economy, which actually, in the end, fully funding childcare ends up paying for itself because of the contributions that women and care workers can then contribute back to the economy. So that's what we advocate for, and that's the kind of future we try to imagine in this book, is if we could imagine solidarity among, different movements like environmental movements, labor movements, people, Indigenous land defenders and water protectors, youth, climate activists. If we work in solidarity together, we imagine that we can have a transformative, winnable future where we can have decent work, where we can have a caring economy that cares for you from cradle to grave, instead of the death economy that we currently have, which, not only is this Canadian economy, which relies on resource extraction, not only does it kill Mother Earth and kill our water systems, it does not provide good, decent work. A lot of the work is long hours under poor working conditions. Albertans have, historically had higher rates of debt, which has been tied to this boom-bust economy of Alberta. Women in Alberta do more hours of unpaid care work than other provinces in Canada. So Alberta does not have decent work. And so I think we need to move towards a decolonial just transition so that working class folks, Indigenous folks, racialized folks can have access to better work and to live a good life. Yeah.
And Jal, thank you so much for articulating the task ahead for us. We all have a lot of work to do, but that coalition building will be a necessity to build that kind of world. Thank you again so much for joining us. Angel joined us on 2 hours notice, so after a long day at the Academic Congress in Toronto. So again, I really appreciate you joining us, and thank you for your insights. And we'll keep our fingers crossed, because it does look like a UCP government, but it's a lot closer than expected. You'll see the ticker is sitting at 50 and 44 is what they need for a majority, but there's still quite a lot of votes to be counted. So we'll hang in there. But thanks again, Angel.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Take
See
care.
you.
That was Angela Look, an assistant professor at York University. So we have a little, Angela actually mentioned leaking
tailings ponds.
Tailings ponds, excuse me. And the Breach actually recently put together a short video which essentially tries to explain the issue of these massive tailings ponds that have been growing under NDP and Conservative governments in Alberta, with a helping hand from the federal government. It's a little piece of satirical video making that we put together a few months ago. So why don't we take a quick look at that? It'll count as an intermission. It's a 5-minute video, and it'll give Addie and I a chance to take a washroom break.
Hello, I'm from the Canadian government with an important update about one of our most cherished traditions, turning pristine waterways into rancid wasteways. For years, the Alberta oil sands have been dealing with a PR problem. Environmental crisis. Slimy mining leftovers that from outer space look like planetary shit stains. These tailing ponds hold 1.4 trillion cubic meters of chemical sludge, a quantity experts refer to as a fuck ton. But not to worry, we've come up with a nifty solution, letting oil companies discharge their problem straight into the Athabasca River. This will release sodium chloride, cancer-causing acids, and toxic government bullshit. Sure, local Indigenous communities that depend on these waters haven't given their consent. And sure, scientists say other options would be much safer. But we can't expect oil companies to spend a tiny portion of their enormous profits cleaning up the mess they created. That would go against everything our government has ever stood for. Fuck you, rivers. You might be asking, what will the effect be of so much waste released into Alberta's largest watershed? Think of it as mystery water. Is it magical? Is it poisonous? Who knows? It's poisonous. In our defense, we've only been ignoring our own reports about the dangers since 1971. And it's not like UNESCO is on the verge of labeling the region a World Heritage Site in danger. Some might be raising an alarm, but we found a much more credible voice. This corporate dingus who claims it will be just like putting your tap water through a Brita filter.
It works just like your Brita filter works at home.
Refreshing. Our Environment Minister, Stephen Guilbeault, has assured the public that the solution will not be decided by industry. It will be decided by our government, which is so far up the ass of big oil, it's too filthy to show you the image. Recall what happened a few years ago, when Alberta's energy regulator ordered oil companies to bury the waste as an alternative to releasing it into the river. The oil companies ignored it, and our government ignored them, ignoring it. And we both hoped you would ignore us, ignoring them, ignoring it. And to make sure the energy regulator never made a mistake like that again, Alberta put an oil lobbyist in charge of it. Cool and normal. It's exactly the kind of commitment that's made us a world leader in pretending to be a world leader in environmentalism. At the end of the day, it's simply easier to let oil companies use our public waters as personal sewers. After all, we already let them use the atmosphere that way, and that's been going great. And since we haven't required oil companies to put aside nearly enough money to clean up the landscape, you'll likely have to foot the bill for tens or even hundreds of billions of dollars. Whoopsie! Think of it as a charity where all the hungry orphans look like this. These ghouls are now just waiting for the green light from our ministry, expected by 2025. Which is why, unless you catch wind of this, we can let the dumping commence.
This message was not approved by David Suzuki.
Well, I hope people enjoyed our little experiment in satirical video writing. That was produced actually by a little collaboration of writers from The Breach, from the people who brought you Hassan Minaj's show, the Canadian scriptwriter on there, and the Beaverton. So hopefully we'll be making a few more of those on pressing Canadian environmental issues.
Well, on that point, Martin, I think it's a good point, a good time to note for our viewers and listeners that this is the kind of work that we're trying to do at The Breach. This is you're not going to hear the perspectives that you just heard on The Breach. You're not going to hear that on other stations. You're not going to hear it on CBC. You're not going to hear it on CTV. We're trying to do a lot with a really small budget. So subscribe, like this video, sign up to be a monthly sustainer so we can do more of this and bring a platform to social movements and advocates to fight back against these forces that are continually trying to tear us apart. So just on that note, I think it's important that we recognize that.
Yeah, you can. People can subscribe to our free newsletter that lands in your inboxes on Sundays with our investigative journalism, our videos, our analysis, and you can get on that newsletter at breachmedia.ca/subscribe. So maybe if someone can throw that into the chat. Every dollar helps. We have about 1,000 paying monthly members, and without them we can't do this work. So we're grateful for their support, and every dollar helps.
Well, Martin, this is a really slow count. It's taking some time.
What's the explanation? Are you hearing an explanation?
So I think folks are all a little bit flummoxed. I think there is a sense that things are slower than usual. Only, I think, less than 5% of votes have come in, perhaps a little more than that by now. But I think one of the takeaways is that in the total number of votes, there's been about 54,000 votes cast as of now that have been reported. And so we can see that the UCP has about 32,000 votes and the NDP has about 22,000 votes reported. So the NDP is still kind of nipping at the heels of the UCP in that regard. I think in terms of seat counts, it's important to note that the NDP has to win 20 seats to hit that 44. But the UCP has a lot more margin for error. So as it stands right now, the NDP is still not really as far ahead as they need to be in order to be competitive in these early stages. But then again, we are talking about really small numbers reporting, so it's hard to draw any real conclusions at this point. But look, we're covering election night, so conclusions we shall draw, right? I do.
Well, as long as we can stay up, this seems like an elaborate joke on Eastern Canadians trying to cover this election. We'll see how long we can last. We'll try to keep broadcasting while we have the energy. But I understand. Speaking of, I understand we have our next guest who's ready to chat with you, Addy.
Sounds good. Let's move on to talking to Brad. Hey, Brad, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing well, Addy. How are you?
Good. Well, folks, listen, we're really pleased to be joined by Brad LaFortune, Executive Director of Public Interest Alberta. Brad's calling us from Edmonton, and as I understand it, from the same brewery as Emma.
That's right. Yeah, we've been having a watch party. We wanted to get people together to celebrate and or commiserate. So we're watching it here at Bent Stick Brewing. If you're in Edmonton, check it out. They're good people. And we're all watching together. So keeping our fingers crossed right now.
I can imagine the tensions must be high, the energy must be high. I can only imagine the adrenaline, and so I'm sure everybody's grateful to have each other to commiserate if need be. Brad, can you tell us a little bit about how folks are feeling? You're around a lot of the folks who have been following this really closely. Tell us a little bit about what you're hearing and how folks are feeling.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'm talking to people who are like inside the campaign, who've been pulling vote, other people who are involved peripherally or have worked on campaigns before, and so have a pretty good sense of how people are feeling across the spectrum. And I think everyone's just kind of biting their nails right now. It's a lot closer than I think even people were expecting it to be. Obviously, we have like a de facto two-party race in our hands, and that was always going to be the case. But it really feels like it's going to be tight. I was hearing from a friend of mine who's working on the E-Day side of things in the NDP right now, and they were saying like it looks like it could be between 42 and 46 seats based on the marks, not just the internal polling, but the hard raw marks they have, which is always kind of what organizers go by. And that's who I like to trust when it comes down to brass tacks. So people are on pins and needles for sure. Results are coming in slowly, but it's going to be really tight, and so it's going to come down to the ground game. I think, Addy, that's what people have been saying, right?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Brad. I mean, folks often get hung up in polls and what the pollsters and pundits are predicting. But you're right. I mean, what it comes down to is the hard data that we have on the ground that tells us exactly who we know is gonna support whichever party you're organizing for. And so I guess I want to know from you. I mean, you've been around the block. You've done this work before. You've you've been organizing with the NDP in the past. Now, of course, right now you have a different role. But as a former staffer, as a former senior staffer, you were chief of staff to a minister, and you've been involved in campaigns and such. What can you tell us about your read of the strategy that the NDP has employed?
Yeah, I mean, number one, it's just like it's been battleground Calgary for 2 years for the NDP. And I'm sure that you've been hearing that from people, and we're all seeing it. If you're from Edmonton or Calgary or whatever, it honestly feels like Calgary has been sort of like the laser focus for the NDP for at least a couple of years. They moved their entire campaign team down there. A lot of the announcements they've made have really been focused on like really narrow slivers of that undecided or movable vote in Calgary. And that's not surprising, right? Because, you know, they were down to 3 seats, you know, between 19 and 23 going into this election. They hung on to only 3 seats. And, you know, like the old kind of cliche about Alberta politics is you have to have like 2 legs of the 3-legged stool. You have to have Edmonton and Calgary, or you have to have rural and Calgary. But you have to have 2 of the 3 legs of the stool. And so, you know, Edmonton is obviously, you know, gonna go orange. I think they're gonna get 20 out of the 20 seats. And Calgary is really where everyone's focused on right now, which makes a lot of sense from a strategic perspective if you're shopping for votes and you're looking for those narrow races. And we also, like Abby, we haven't seen a 2-party race in this province since I've been around. Like if you look at 15, when we were both working on NDP campaigns, you know, the NDP came up, it was a wave for sure, but also, you know, a couple of those races were within, I think there was one in Calgary that was like 6 votes between the NDP and the UCP, and they eked it out. So you had that split between the Wild Rose and the Progressive Conservatives that you don't have anymore. And so the NDP really knew they had to focus on, you know, winning those tight 2-way races. And that really centered on Calgary, and also that like donut, you know, suburban Edmonton as well. I think they've done a really good job of focusing on those movable votes. And obviously, you know, you saw things like, you know, tax credits, which like we haven't seen before from the Alberta NDP. They're trying to look for those, you know, kind of more kind of like wholesale or retail kind of like policies. They're going to move that movable vote. Oh, I hear people in the background who are probably yelling for Janice Irwin's 98% or something like that. But yeah, I mean, they've really been focused on just that really narrow sliver of vote in Calgary to try to pick up, you know, 15, 16, 17 seats in Calgary. They have to win if they're going to form government. So
yeah, tell me a little bit about that, because I mean, we have obviously there's a tension between the party's history with the kinds of politics and the kinds of policies the party historically has put forward, and over the course of the last while, that has shifted a little bit in terms of where, or maybe more than a little bit, in terms of where the party, the NDP, is now headed, and the kinds of promises they're making, the kinds of you know, you talked a little bit about the kind of the sliver that they're really trying to get to, and you reminded me of the hometown Alberta announcement that they made, which seemed really targeted at a very particular demographic, that we're going to build you a hockey rink. You know, tell me a little bit more about that sort of calculus that the party has made.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so like you had, so like just to like at the highest level, you had some seats in Calgary where they had to move the vote, like, you know, they had to flip the vote from the UCP to the NDP between like 12 and 19% of the vote. That's a massive chunk they have to flip, right? So they're looking at, you know, it's skewing towards women, it's skewing towards younger voters, it's skewing towards racialized voters as well. And then geographically, like they have to pick up Northeast Calgary more than just the one seat they have now, Northwest as well, and then some of those central ridings. But when it comes to the policy like hometown hockey, or the tax credits, where it's like, you know, you're going to be able to put your kid into hockey if you're a family who cares about that, I think they're really targeting like sort of like, you know, people who identify as, you know, they're working class voters, but they identify as middle class voters, and they see themselves as, you know, looking for some affordability measures that are really targeted for themselves and their family. And so the campaign really seemed to get away from, the NDP campaign seemed to really get away from big social democratic throws on, making healthcare public again and making sure that like education is fully public again. And, childcare is there obviously with the federal program, but in terms of building out a system that is not only affordable, but high quality, accessible, and inclusive, and has like really good curriculum, that kind of thing. We didn't see any big policy throws or offers that were like hugely socially democratic, transformative, and visionary at that level. They were really targeting, those demographics in Calgary and around the province for sure, that, really were about, I guess, pocketbook issues, issues that might save. I think the average family, Rachel Notley said the other day, that they're going to save, $1,000 under the NDP's affordability plan on average, but up to several $1,000s depending on your situation. And that's really where they went, rather than talking about, strengthening and rebuilding and revitalizing public services at a higher level, which is what, Public Interest Alberta is all about, and more traditional social democratic NDP voters are about. And they tend to be in Edmonton, but they also exist across the province as well. So they were really targeting those sort of retail affordability measures. I mean, even, what was it? I think it was 2008. Correct me if I'm wrong, Addie, but I think the first time we saw tax credits really become a big issue on the main stage federally. Those were Stephen Harper tax credits they were talking about, right? So cash back in the pockets of voters that will make a real difference, especially in this affordability crisis, but aren't really focused on those systemic issues and rebuilding the public services that have been really, really hampered by bad cuts and bad policies.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because the kind of the tax credit versus benefit kind of, not to get too wonky here, but just in order to be for a tax credit program to be successful, you kind of have to make enough money to be paying taxes to get the credit on it in the first place. But the Alberta NDP's child benefit that cut poverty in half. I don't think I know they've brought it up a few times, but it's easily one of the most significant achievements of the 2015-2019 Rachel Notley administration. And so it's all, you pointed out, of course, this sort of fixation on pocketbook issues, but at the same time, I think folks would argue that all of those other things that you mentioned are also pocketbook issues, whether we're talking about healthcare, keeping healthcare public, making childcare public, all of that. It comes down to folks not having to pay out of pocket because we're all sharing the costs as a community. Tell me a little bit about what you think the NDP, what's going on in the NDP headquarters right now. Do you think what kind of conversations do you think they're having right now? Do you think that they feel like they've succeeded? Do you think that they feel like this was the best it was ever going to get? What do you think is happening there right now?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And I've got a lot of people that I know and love who are colleagues and comrades who are working on that campaign right now. I don't know if they're tuning into our live stream of The Breach, but I think that, okay, so I'll say a couple things. I remember after 2019, I remember the narrative that really took hold within the NDP when they did their debrief and they were talking to members and supporters, and they were like, you know what, the UCP, the movement that coalesced around Jason Kenney, was a juggernaut. And the debrief really focused on, I think, a very fair argument that the NDP put together the best campaign they possibly could have, given the circumstances. A UCP party that was just on the move, right? It was a real juggernaut. And also 4 years between 2015 and 2019 that were really tough economically for the governing NDP. Not to mention there was, a massive forest fire that, wiped out a huge chunk of Fort McMurray. Bill 6, the farm safety bill, was a real challenge. And then the way that the climate leadership plan rolled out. And so anyway, long story short, coming out of 2019 after the election when the NDP lost, there was a real sense amongst people who were really intimately involved in the campaign that they truly believed that was the best they could have done. And I don't really disagree with that. It's the first time we had a two-party race where the NDP was competitive, and it was a completely different ballgame. I think right now what people are thinking, I mean, like, you know, we've got like what 10 or 12% of the polls reporting right now. I think people are really just sort of like on pins and needles, and thinking that, you know, their internals and their marks are telling them this could go either way. But insofar as they might be having questions and conversations now or in the near term, I wonder if there won't be a little bit of a conversation about how much the leadership question became like the focal issue in the campaign.
You mean the leadership of Danielle Smith?
Yeah, the leadership of Danielle Smith versus Rachel Notley. You know, and I wonder about like the conversation they're going to have about that, because it felt, I don't know if this is accurate. I mean, we all have our bubbles, but it really felt like in 2019 they went hard at Jason Kenney on the character and leadership question, right? Like, what does your character say about how you're going to lead? I mean, we had people who were like in San Francisco talking to people who were there when Jason Kenney was, you know, going to hospitals and essentially harassing families and people who were, you know, dying of HIV/AIDS, and it just didn't resonate with people to the level that I think the campaign wanted it to internally. Danielle Smith has said some really egregious shit, like the Nazis have entered, you know, the campaign here, right? Like, she's not wearing a poppy because, you know, of like public safety protocol. It's been wild, but I think that kind of like just onslaught of character oppo hits, I think reached a saturation point about 2 or 3 weeks ago, potentially. And then I think the issues maybe took a back seat to that back and forth about, you know, Rachel v. Danielle Smith. And I wonder if there's going to be a conversation about how much focus there was on leadership and character versus the issues that people are concerned about. Because for months, I think, you know, from what I'm seeing, and I don't have the best polling, you know, like I work for PIA, but from what I'm seeing and hearing, it was about affordability, it was about healthcare, and it was about the economy, right? And those are, I mean, at least 2 out of 3, those are issues that I think, you know, Social Democrats could really put together a winning campaign on. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. I mean, there will be time for that. Right now, obviously, results are coming in slowly, but
it's really hard to know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
You know, listen, this is super interesting. I think a lot of folks are, you know, have been talking a lot about this sort of the negative campaign and how has that really played out, and I think a lot of folks have a similar analysis around, you know, maybe hammering on several scandals one after another actually just lowers the bar. So the person just has to kind of do one thing better, and it kind of is the Trump effect. You just have to act presidential one time, and that's the time that everybody talks about, and then you get elected. Listen, really interesting conversation, Brad. We're gonna have to leave it there for now, but I understand that we might be able to have you back. So I'm gonna leave you there for now. Brad, thanks so much for joining us. I really appreciate your time, folks. That was Brad LaFortune, the executive director of Public Interest Alberta. I'm gonna hand it back to Martin for a second here to give us an update. Martin, you're on mute.
All right, well, that's a third and hopefully last time that happens. Just a quick update about the numbers that are coming in. Apparently, Elections Alberta has issued a statement to the effect of everything is fine. But apparently the talking heads on CBC say everything is not fine. There seems to be something that has gone wrong. We haven't seen this kind of slow counting in a while, so it may yet be a long night. So we'll just have to sit tight and see if they can sort out their problems. Meanwhile, Adi, I think we have another guest who's ready to talk to you.
All right, thanks, Martin. All right, wow. Well, hi, Des. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. You're in a fancy office, I see.
Yeah, I'm actually just currently outside the polls. I was a scrutineer, and so it's been a really interesting night. Just a big turnout in Lloydminster, which is incredible. Typically, it tends to be quite a small turnout here, so I was really happy to see lots of new first-time voters and young people. It was really cool.
Awesome. Well, folks, for our viewers and listeners, Des, I'll just quickly introduce you to the folks who are following along. Des is based in Lloydminster, as she said, border town between Alberta and Saskatchewan. Folks affectionately refer to this town as Lloyd. If you're following along from outside of Alberta or Saskatchewan. Fun fact: you can save up to $50 in your phone plan if you register on the Saskatchewan side. Lloyd's an oil town, so Des has seen up close how the boom and bust cycles of the fossil fuel industry can affect people. Des, your day job is in a gun store.
Yeah,
but
it's something.
It is. I can only imagine. It certainly proves that you can't. It doesn't mean that you can't also advocate for climate justice and workers' rights, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, tell us a little bit about what's going on in Lloyd, Des. You've told us already a little bit that you've been a scrutineer. Tell us, first of all, tell us what is a scrutineer, so folks know, if folks haven't heard that term before. But tell us about what's happening at Lloyd right now.
Yeah, for sure. So scrutineering is essentially, I'm just watching them count the votes for the election, making sure that there's no additional ballots coming in, ballots getting missed, stuff like that. And it's essentially just another check that they have with Elections Alberta, just to make sure that everything is going smoothly. And so far at our polling station, at least things are going well. Obviously, I can't get into too much. There is a lot of confidentiality around being a scrutineer, but we are seeing a crazy amount of votes. We're doing all the counting and watching everybody count. And actually a little wild, all of the scrutineers, aside from one person, is actually they're from the NDP. I was asked by the NDP, although candidly I was supporting the Green candidate for Vermilion Lloydminster Wainwright, T. Gurley Campbell. She's a really great friend of mine. She's a fantastic advocate in this community, and I really respect her and her anti-racism work, her work in the community and everything. But I was asked by the NDP first, and I like to, play both sides and try and be friendly with them. Yeah, it's been a pretty cool night so far. I know lots of people voted, that at least in to people I typically talk to, most of the people that I'm friends with and acquainted with voted early. So most of the people I saw coming out tonight were people that I didn't really know in the community, but it was a lot. There's probably one of the most amounts of ballots that I've seen in a poll, which is really great. Yeah, I don't really know what else to say. Lloyd's a very conservative town. From my experience running here as the NDP candidate federally in 2021, I did experience a lot of talking to different people and different viewpoints, but conservative is kind of the usual. Everybody here, their family voted conservative. They work in the oil field, and the oil field does encourage you to vote conservative as well, and that's just part of the climate politically around here. Although I have seen changes in the last couple of years, especially with those young people, and there's the diversity in Lloyd has been changing a lot, which is fantastic to see. Lots of different cultures coming together in Lloyd, and so yeah, it's a lot less white than it used to be, and a lot less racist, but it's still kind of white and kind of racist.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting point, because I remember in 2015 there was the oil industry executives put a video together trying to convince everybody that voting for the NDP would be the end of the world. And that kind of backfired on them, and then the NDP won that election.
Mm-hmm.
I imagine that sort of approach is something that you see on a day-to-day in Lloyd. And so tell us a little bit about that. I mean, you have many close friends and family who worked in oil. Mm-hmm. Can you speak to what's currently missing in the current conversation between kind of workers' rights and the fossil fuel industry?
Totally. I'm gonna start off kind of with a personal story. So my partner actually worked in the oil field for a very long time. One of the things that we had noted about his time in the oil field is not only just the blatant violation of workers' rights, where he would work like 4:30 in the morning. He'd be getting picked up for 5, and he'd be working until 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, sometimes 9 o'clock at night, which is just abhorrent to do 10 days straight. A lot of times he would lose his weekends off because the rig had to get moved or get finished. I remember very specifically, kind of towards the end of his time in the oil field, because I had actually encouraged him to leave. He had come home probably like 9 o'clock. He told me, I can't go to work tomorrow unless I get this training done. It's 3 hours long. And I said, okay, I'm going to help you do it, because, I don't work tomorrow. We're going to get this done. And his training, it was, and it sounds like a joke. It sounds like something that like 22 minutes would write. But his training was how not to be tired at work, how not to fall asleep at the wheel. And it was just traumatic video after traumatic video of people dying in their cars because they fall asleep at the wheel. And that's what they expected these workers to watch for 3 hours after working from 4 o'clock to like 9 o'clock and then being expected to do the exact same thing the next day. And there was no hint of irony, no hint of like critical thinking from their supervisors. They just said, you need to get this done. If you come in tomorrow and it's not done, you can't work. But we need you to work because everybody needs this job to get done. And there's a really big attitude like that of you can't call in sick, you can't miss this because you're going to affect all of us. And it gets really stressful for oil field workers. And the big thing with oil field workers that not a lot of people talk about is that because of the way that their schedules are structured and the way that their work has expectations of them, where you're working until your body's broken, you're working until all of your social connections outside of work are completely decimated because you don't see people, you don't see your family, you don't see your spouse. My partner and I, like, we had some issues in our relationship because we were both working full time, but my full time was 40 hours a week and his full time was 110 some days. And so it was just so hard for us to keep this relationship and keep to just even know each other and get to know each other. And so oilfield workers really depend on each other for that social aspect. And that can breed a lot of really negative social behaviors, because when you get a bunch of people who all joined the oil field right after high school because you can either work a $15 job somewhere without experience, or you can get right into oil field and you're guaranteed to make 28 to 32. Back in the older days, it was a $35 job right out of high school. And a lot of people wanted that. They saw that as a good thing. But when you get into this industry, when you become an oil field worker, you're blacklisted. Every business that I've talked to. Oh, go ahead.
Just going to jump in there, Des, for a second, because this you're absolutely hitting a really important point. It feels like a really important conversation about workers' rights and the kinds of approach that these companies take to this really high stress, extremely dangerous work has been kind of absent in the discourse that we've been seeing in this election period. It's not to say that it hasn't come up prior to the writ, but can you tell us a little bit about what you would have liked to have heard?
Yeah. I would have liked to have heard more conversations on giving oil field workers work outside of the oil field. We've talked about just transition, and a lot of oil field workers kind of find that scary because they hear just transition and they don't hear that piece of carrying the workers forward. They only hear, I'm losing my job. I'm going to lose the oil field. And that is so easy to take and polarize to the point where everyone in the oil field says, nope, just transition means I don't have a job anymore. And kind of like I was saying, one of the things that I have noted, and a lot of people have talked to me about, when you work in the oil field, you get blacklisted from other jobs. They won't hire you. They assume that you're going to go back to the oil field where you're going to get better pay. They assume that you're just this rig hand, you're a rough and gruff kind of dude. And so you don't get callbacks. My partner, we've talked before, and his boss had even said to him the only reason that he got a call was because they just so happened to need somebody that day, and he was the only person who picked up because he was unemployed at the time. He didn't work though from October until February. No one called him back. He put out hundreds of resumes, and the second they see that oil field, it's gone. And a lot of oil field workers know that, and so there's this fear that just transition means no jobs, and they know they can't get jobs in other places. So having the conversation that's more about, if we're transitioning, we need to focus on worker-based transition. We need to listen to the oil field workers who are afraid and who are, they see this as a loss of their livelihoods, a loss of the only thing that they can do to live. And it's unfair of us to speak, especially as environmentalists. One of the things that I've really learned is talking about how that looks for the oil field workers. We need to talk about training, applicable skills for these people, and providing that to them without any kind of expectation of them paying for that. We need to provide, all of when you go into oil field, you have to buy your own tickets. We should be talking about having that actually paid for by our just transition. We should be paying for that as included. And realistically, we should be talking about the oil field paying for these workers to move into that just transition, because we know that the oil field has billions and billions of dollars, and so much capital that they just use to lobby and to pay off their CEOs and to pay off all of their shareholders when they should be using that money.
We were just having this conversation a little while earlier with Emma Jackson, who was pointing out that these these oil companies have really inserted themselves into communities in a way that communities really feel like they depend on these companies, and can't really imagine an alternative future where they aren't dependent on these companies. And it's the same kind of hold that the industry has throughout politics, not just in individual communities, but also kind of across the province. So I guess the question that political parties have to grapple with is, if you really want to put forward a progressive vision, what does that progressive vision look like in this reality, and how do you really sell it? Like, what are your thoughts on, as somebody who, you're closely tied up in the industry, you understand the impacts it has on families, you have run for the NDP in the past, you have you're involved in the party now. How would you, if the folks deciding the Alberta NDP strategy were sitting in front of you right now, what would you tell them about what they need to be taught, what they need to be saying to rural voters about what a progressive vision looks like?
I think one of the biggest things is the reassurance that you're not going to lose your livelihood, that you can build communities without the influence of the oil field, without the influence of these multi-billion-dollar companies, without these companies that will fire you for being too safe because you're not fast enough. And that's something that is missing from the conversation, is just talking about the reality of the oil field and using that as a jumping off point to talk about the rights that those workers are missing, and then incorporating in that just transition, talking more about the fact that, our province is on fire. Should we be considering using more fossil fuels? And I think one of the problems in politics right now, especially with progressives, sorry, I'm moving my phone around a lot, it's been a long day. One of the things that's really missing from the conversation in progressive politics when it comes to the oil field is that the progressives are bought too. They're completely bought by the oil field as well. And I find it really hypocritical in some aspects that we try and talk about being environmentally friendly when there are MPs and MLAs who have, who are on the NDP side, who are progressive, who have shares in the oil field, who make money. Rachel Notley's NDP. I do want the UCP to lose. Does the NDP winning really make too much of a difference? Not really, in my opinion. When Rachel Notley bought a pipeline, she's purchased by the oil field. John Horgan's NDP, and then on top of that, David Eby's NDP are purchased and bought for by the oil field. And to an extension of that, Jagmeet Singh choosing not to talk about Wet'suwet'en and the issues around that also shows me that that's purchased by the oil field. And so, can we have those conversations about a real just transition when the people who are in charge, regardless of what colors they're wearing, have investments and have stakes in the industry that's killing our planet, killing workers, killing families who rely on the oil field for their capital, because it is really destroying those families, especially when we see these recessions. They'll lay you off. It doesn't matter how many years of service, because they know that they'll pick up some 18-year-old who's never worked before, and he'll work for less doing the same job with 3 days of training on a computer. And there just isn't a realistic conversation. And I don't know all of the ways to come about that realistic conversation, but they're there. And we have to be realistic and grounded about the way that we're talking about these things. And we can't be putting ourselves as progressives in really any camp environmentally right now, because the reality is that regardless of where we're walking and operating, for the most part, there's somebody who's bought. The only people I can think of off the top of my head who I haven't seen that from is the Alberta Green Party, and that's Jordan Wilkie has done a fantastic job in turning that party around and really doing a lot of really cool work. I respect him a lot, but it is a reality that it's hard to talk about environmentalism and a just transition when anybody across the political spectrum is bought by the oil field.
It is a very, very difficult conversation, to be sure. It's especially, I think one of the points that you made, which really resonates with me is that folks in the oil industry, workers in the oil industry are not looking to do this their entire lives. They're not looking to do this for their children. They don't want their children to be doing this. Folks are looking for an out, and there is another future that we could be talking about, and that we need to be talking about, because this isn't going to last forever. And if we pretend like it does, we might be going down a dark path. So listen, Des, I appreciate you coming on. You're in your car, you're in the middle of several things, you're engaging in the nitty gritty of democracy right now, with being a scrutineer and all of those things. So thank you. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to chat about politics and just be a political menace in general.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Des. Folks, that was Des Bissonnette coming to us live from Lloydminster, Alberta, fresh outside of a polling station. Hey, Martin.
What an exhilarating example that just obliterates all the stereotypes about rural Alberta. Just goes to show that notions about a monolithic conservative rural Alberta are, should be looked at closely and complicated a bit. So that was refreshing.
Yeah, absolutely.
I loved her analysis. We're starting to see a few more, vote dumps happening. Yeah, I mean, it does look like the UCP is, kind of stabilizing that lead. I know Brad was, trying to maintain an optimistic spirit, but I mean, again, yeah, it's 24% of polls have reported, so it's not a done deal by any account, but like the trend lines are starting to emerge. Danielle Smith has been confirmed as winning her riding, the first really fully confirmed one. There's a few more actually coming in now. In a few rural spots. Calgary votes are not really materializing yet as much as other places. So some of those might be up in the air, some of those key ridings for the NDP still. But right now it definitely looks like a majority for the UCP, a diminished one, certainly, at 52 seats. But kind of astonishing to think, when you looked at the polling a few months ago and the kind of, shambling, far right politician that Danielle Smith is. So I'm sure progressives, NDP partisans are going to be really disappointed if this result holds.
Yeah, interesting results, Martin. I'm looking at some of these numbers come in as well, and it looks like, of course, while a few ridings have been called for the UCP, only one appears to have been called for the NDP, and that's one in Edmonton Meadows, and that's Jaspreet Deol, an incumbent MLA who has been reelected. It's interesting though that some of the stronghold ridings are reporting some pretty close numbers. I'm looking at the numbers out of Edmonton, Beverly, Clairview again. We talked a little bit earlier about Peggy Wright, who former Alberta NDP party president, longtime advocate in the community, deep roots in the riding. 50% to 45.6%. I mean, she's leading, but by a razor thin margin. So it's looking like things are going to be pretty close as we continue along the night. Calgary, of course, continues to look the same way. I'm surprised at how slowly the numbers are coming in from Calgary, for sure. I think like many others are, but it does look pretty orange at the moment in terms of leading seats, and I think the NDP will probably be happy to see some of these seats. They probably wanted to see Calgary Glenmore and Calgary Bow go NDP early on, but they might have to wait a little longer to see that happen.
Well, let's. I understand we have Ricardo Acuna on deck again, so why don't we bring him back in? Hey, Ricardo, welcome back.
Hey, guys.
Hey, Ricardo.
Are you getting tired yet?
Oh, definitely.
It's a long night. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. You know, it's frustrating. And I think part of this is just having been through so many of these things in Alberta over the years. You know, for most of my life, Alberta elections were decided by 5 minutes after the polls closed, right? I mean, you could call a conservative majority. The question was whether there'd be 5 or 12 opposition members, and that was it, done. And I think, as I said when last we chatted, I think this is a sign that things have shifted politically, despite it looking like the UCP's, got this so far. Although there's some some key ridings, some battleground ridings that are still really close. I think it shows a race of this closeness in Alberta is not something we're used to here. And it shows that there's been a political shift. What exactly that'll mean in the long term is hard to say, but clearly there's something going on here.
Well, Ricardo, are you seeing anything here that you weren't expecting tonight? Is what
No, other than the really, really slow vote count. I mean, the numbers, the early numbers in terms of popular vote are a little more spread out than I thought they would be. I thought it would be a little closer. I think the last look I had here has got the UCP at just under 56 and the Alberta New Democrats at just over 40. So it's starting to narrow a bit from where it was even just 10 minutes ago. So that was a bit of a surprise. But look, the reality is this, right? In terms of what played out, 2 weeks ago, we were hearing that there were 20% in the polls that were undecided. A lot of those folks, I suspect, those wary conservatives, the conservatives that maybe didn't want to cast for Danielle Smith, as we got closer to E-Day, that undecided polling closed to about 10%. So by yesterday, most of the polls had it at 7 to 10%. And I think those folks moved and they decided to actually show up and vote conservative. And that seems to be what's playing out in a lot of these ridings.
Yeah, this is this seems exactly the weirdest thing about all of this is how slow the numbers are coming in, for sure. But one of the other things that I can't quite get over is just in terms of the overall vote share, how close it is. Because in the 2019 election, of course, it's not that close. If you look at 160,000 votes in total for the NDP, for the UCP, and 117,000 votes currently coming in for the NDP, but between the 2015 and 2019 election, with the sheer change in the number of votes that came in, and the vast majority of the new votes going to the UCP, it really kind of it's interesting to see the as the night goes along that the gap between the NDP and the UCP so far isn't as high as the 2019 results might have suggested that it would have been. Martin, what are your thoughts?
Well, I'm curious to hear a bit more from Ricardo. I don't know if you were listening to Des speak, but I was struck by something she was saying, and also something that you write about in your book, which is that in many ways it feels like politics in Alberta, and certainly those of the conservative, side, UCP, hasn't really caught up with the fact that Alberta has really changed over the last generation. So especially in the urban areas, but even beyond that, the population is just much more socially liberal, open to environmentally friendly policies. Give me a sense of that. I think for people outside the province, we're constantly bombarded still to this day with the story that, Alberta is a resolutely conservative place and will never be anything but.
For the last more than a decade now, both of Alberta's major cities have had centrist to left centrist mayors, right? And that's a good sign. I mean, that municipal politics is the level of politics that's closest to that kind of grassroots. And the fact that in Edmonton and Calgary, populations have been able and willing to elect progressive mayors, I think that says a lot about where Albertans are. One of the issues in Alberta is that there's been a failure, particularly, say, on behalf of New Democrats, to engage meaningfully. And Des was talking a little bit with rural Alberta. It's almost like rural Alberta is, generally gets written off. We're not going to win those votes. Why would we invest limited resources there? Seems to be the thinking. That said, there's an accompanying reality that in places like, even if you look at the numbers starting to come in tonight, in places like Lethbridge, where both of the Lethbridge ridings are currently in play, Banff Kananaskis, which is still in play for Edmonton, right? Sherwood Park, like some of those areas, we are starting to see gains for the New Democrats. So there is some progress being made there. There are messages that are landing. Polling in significant parts of rural Alberta show the degree to which municipalities and landowners are frustrated and angry at the government's failure to properly stand up to the oil industry on their behalf when it comes to abandoned wells and cleaning up orphan wells left in the areas, right? So there's a lot more nuance to Alberta politics, and I think gets transmitted outwardly. I think the final hurdle here is there's some messaging and there's some mythology that dies hard. The whole narrative about Central Canada and environmentalists wanting to shut down the oil industry, about the way that just transition was framed by both Pierre Poilievre and Danielle Smith as being a plan to get rid of jobs in Alberta. I mean, those are problematic narratives, and they rely on some hangover feelings of alienation in the province. And I think that's kind of that last remaining hurdle. And as I said earlier, like the closeness of this race starts to speak to the fact that those narratives are having less and less impact.
And Ricardo, can I just ask you to expand a little bit on something you just said? You were touching on this real peculiarity of Alberta rural progressivism, which is rooted in kind of property rights in some way, where these pipelines and such running through farmers' lands, and there's this tension between farmers and folks in rural Alberta with oil companies over some of these questions, and there might be some common ground there. And we saw that kind of play out in the 2015 election when we saw a large number of kind of northern Alberta ridings go NDP in 2015. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about whether kind of not focusing on those ridings, not focusing on rural Alberta as much, just kind of maybe it's too harsh to say writing off rural Alberta, but what seems like kind of a write-off strategy for rural Alberta, was that a mistake?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's room there for an important conversation for an economic development strategies for these rural communities. Many of these rural communities are losing people very quickly. Younger generations aren't wanting to stay in the rural communities. They're not wanting to stay on the land. They don't see a future for farming. They're frustrated with oil and gas contamination. They're frustrated with the environment. They're facing the environmental impacts of drought or of severe weather or of fires like we've just seen over the last month in Alberta. And I think it's a huge miss not to take kind of some, standard, not super radical, but just moderately progressive policies about transition, about developing economic development strategies in conversation with rural communities, not developed in downtown Edmonton or, God forbid, downtown Toronto and imposed on rural communities. But, these folks have lived on that land, right, for very many years. And if we include them in these conversations for a rural development strategy, for economic development, for energy alternatives and how they can actually help these local communities, I think there's something very positive to be had there, right? Because right now what's happened is the UCP shouts some very loud words about the NDP and the Liberal NDP alliance in Ottawa hating farmers and hating Alberta workers and hating the land and wanting to shut down our economy. And nobody's saying anything differently. So that, there's, like I said, there's those old narratives that kind of have staying power and they're not hearing any alternatives. So that has some traction. Whereas if the parties actually took the time to engage in these conversations with folks in these communities in a legitimate way, I think there's some hope to have some political change in those areas.
And
there's
you're
also the reality.
Yeah, go ahead, Ricardo. Sorry.
Yeah,
go
there's
ahead.
also the reality that electorally, rural Alberta is way overrepresented in the legislature, right? There's a huge difference between the weight of a rural vote in Alberta and the weight of a municipal vote in Alberta. And I think whoever forms government, when they go to do the electoral boundaries review, which will be due over the term of the next government, has to seriously take a look at that. When it was done during the NDP's reign from 2015 to 2019, I think there was some reluctance to mess with it too much out of fear of further alienating rural Alberta. But there's, the least populous rural riding has about half as many voters, if not less, than the most populous urban riding, which means some of those ridings have a vote advantage of 2 votes to 1 for the value of every vote cast. And that's not sustainable in terms of, the reality of population growth in the province.
It's a trade-off too, of course, with the size of those ridings. But yeah, I mean, points well taken. Mm-hmm. It's a long-standing conversation in the province about what that means for balancing some of these needs in rural and urban centers, and how we actually accomplish anything when those needs are sometimes diametrically opposite, and sometimes and there's that weight on the rural side of things. Martin, what are you thinking? You're still muted. This is strike 4, I think, Martin. Maybe 5.
I think that's it. I think I just need to log off. I'm curious, Ricardo, if the vote holds, is that enough to ensure that Rachel Notley stays on as leader, or are you going to see, the burblings of, a leadership challenge?
I honestly think this is Rachel Notley's last election either way. Even if the NDP had won, I think this would be Rachel Notley's last election. The timing would, I think, be different. If it's a loss for the NDP, I think, she stays in power maybe a year and a half before launching a race. I think if the NDP wins, I think she gives enough time to, strategically have a leadership race to replace her, with 18 months to a year left in the term, in order to, ride the momentum of a leadership race. But I think either way, this was her last campaign. I think she wanted one more run at it. I think she's gotten it. She's clearly improved, regardless of where this thing ends tonight. It's clearly an improvement from 2019, and I think she'll be able to walk away feeling comfortable that she's done what she could to advance the party in Alberta.
And any sense of who some leadership contenders might be, and are there any obvious or progressive kind of front runners there?
I mean, I think there's a lot of folks who were key cabinet ministers in that 2015 to 2019 government that come to mind as potential leadership material. Thinking particularly of David Eggen, who actually ran against Rachel in the previous leadership race that the party had. Sarah Hoffman, who is deputy leader right now. Folks like that, right, who've been around for a while, who've got name recognition, who've got profile. I don't see a lot of other kind of names start to trickle forward, but I think after tonight, again, regardless of what happens, we'll start to see folks start to position themselves for potential runs at the leadership. Super
interesting stuff, Ricardo. I mean, I don't know what we're gonna see at the end of this night. Every minute seems to bring a new surprise. We're currently now at 12 elected seats for the UCP, and only 5 for the NDP. Interestingly, the obviously Highlands Norwood has been called for Janice Irwin. I think Edmonton Meadows was the first seat called in Edmonton for the NDP. There's City Centre and Edmonton Strathcona. I was surprised that Edmonton Strathcona wasn't the first to be called, but it might have just been a function of slow.
The votes were coming in really slowly. Right?
Yeah, I'm still looking at these numbers and seeing that. I think they might have called Beverly Clairview for Peggy Wright, which I guess that was only a matter of time. So that's interesting to see. What are you expecting any surprises in these two urban centers as we move along?
No, I mean, I think Edmonton's complete, right? I think Edmonton, that sweep is from what I'm seeing right now in terms of the numbers. West Henday is still a little tight. But I think for the most part, Edmonton is well in hand, as expected, right? I mean, the sweep of Edmonton was expected. I think Calgary, a few of these key seats are going to bounce back and forth over the course of the night. Some of them are still quite close, or with very few, very few voting stations reporting. If you look at, for example, Calgary East, you see, 563 for the UCP and 555 votes for the NDP, and that's one of those ones that should be in the NDP's universe. So that's going to bounce back and forth a few times. But Calgary seems to be playing out a lot like it was expected. So, there's really no big surprises here. It's just a matter of scope, right? The number of seats that are in play is maybe not what the NDP needed, right? Right now they're sitting at 38 or 39 seats that they're leading in, and that's not outside of the margin of error of what was being said they would come up with, right?
Yeah, it's sorry, I was having trouble unmuting myself there. Yeah, it's hard. It's honestly still really hard to kind of be like, okay, are we about to be hit with something totally out of the blue, or is it just gonna continue along, chugging along this way? I'm looking at the Calgary numbers come in very, very slowly. I mean, there's no seat called for the UCP in Calgary, which tells me that this is still kind of battleground Calgary, right? And so. Still lots to see as the night goes on, and Martin was saying earlier, are they just trying to do this to make it harder for us out east here covering this
to
election?
Keep track. Yep.
As we hit past midnight now for us here. Well, Ricardo, listen, we're gonna leave it at that for now. I just wanted to say thank you for coming back on. Always really great insight, a really interesting conversation, and we'll be in touch as the night goes on.
Absolutely. It's been great chatting with you guys. Thank you so much for doing this, and thank you for having me on.
Thanks, Ricardo. Well, folks, that was Ricardo Cunha again, Executive Director of Parkland Institute. Martin, I think we have Romy waiting to join us now. Hi, Romy. Welcome back.
My turn to have trouble with the mute button. Hi, welcome, or not welcome. I'm happy to be back. How's it
we
going?
are happy that you're back as well. Thanks for coming back. It's what a night. What are some of your reflections so far?
Well, I mean, I'm clearly discombobulated myself, just as much as Alberta elections is. I think there's a lot of commentary, especially I think with the sort of like election organizers that I have access to and I talk to on a regular basis. Just as Brad was saying, we have friends in the field that are pretty confused that this is taking so long. I can't help but think that, Take Back Alberta, as Press Progress had reported, was training scrutineers at one point to really keep a keen eye on some of those key battleground ridings. We really have no idea what their plans actually were, but there's a lot of evidence that there's a lot of volunteers that were going to be involved this time around from both ends, but from the UCP side of things and Take Back Alberta side of things, there was some pretty clear understanding that, like this is an election to get involved in. And so I don't know what's going on. So I'm discombobulated and I'm really hoping to see some clarity.
Yeah, we don't know what's happened with that effort that Take Back Alberta had in terms of sending scrutineers into polling stations. We don't really know what happened there, do we? In the end.
Not in the end. No, I think hopefully mainstream as well as independent media journalists are keeping an eye tonight. It is hard to do though if you're not like a partisan volunteer. You have to be a part of a campaign to be a scrutineer. So not really sure how much access I think the media could have to that kind of information, but. It really causes a lot of questions right now, and I'm hoping that it's just something else rather than foul play.
Yeah, and I remember that your reporting had tried to get Take Back Alberta to talk a little bit about it, and they categorically denied they had anything to do with it. And so, yeah, I mean, to your point, it's going to be pretty hard to get any kind of information out in terms of what actually happened with respect to that.
I don't know if you guys are Succession fans, but this is bringing up images of election night in America with with the alt-right like movement like firebombing a voting booth in order to like destroy evidence of or destroy votes that would be going to the Democrat. Obviously there's no reports on Twitter or such activities, and my hunch is that Take Back Alberta was, I mean, to their credit, just doing really, really good organizing. And I think the right, unfortunately, has in many respects, when it comes to the brass tacks, just been out organizing the left. That said, I don't want to, perhaps there is foul play, but my hunch is that they've just been really good at tapping into that anger that you talked about earlier, Romy, and just mobilizing and channeling a lot of that energy into that kind of organizing.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think if anything, right, like the worst case scenario, borderline conspiracy side of things is thinking that there's foul play. But I think realistically, we can talk about how it certainly informs public discussion, and especially from those organizers and from that camp, they're able to incite some, untrustworthiness in the system, right? They're able to call into question how well our democratic institutions are running, and further it like just motivate their base and those folks into wondering, is this system working in the way that it's supposed to? Is it serving me? Who can we look to elect or to lead us that we can actually trust and isn't going to try to run a fast one on us? Like there is a lot of that feeling of disenfranchisement, as I was saying before, and so situations like this I think don't really help, which is why there's even more motivation, I think, for the NDP to really tap into that in a way that's genuinely from the left, in a like a healthy populist way, which I think is totally possible. I think the word populism, and Emma was talking about it before, has really been, I don't know, I guess taken by like the liberal sort of democratic pundit class to mean something bad, but it doesn't have to. I mean, it's really just tapping into what matters to everyday people on the ground, in their lives, like in the, in their average livelihoods, right? Like how they put food on their tables, how they interact with their neighbors and in their communities. Like just realizing, Ricardo was also talking about that too, realizing that we really just need to talk to communities and have those conversations with them, rather than, going the third way that we've classically seen over the last couple of decades, which is trying to win the media war and the air war through messaging. We know that that's not long-lasting strategy. So to those, to try to tackle some of that, like the misinformation, that anger, and all of that's being tapped into from folks that follow Take Back Alberta, I think you just really need to do ground organizing. I can't stress that enough.
And Romy, can I just ask a question to you about that? I don't know if you heard Brad when he was on a little while ago. He was talking a little bit about this idea of ground game versus the comms game and so on, in which he sort of talked about some of the stuff that he's hearing from folks on the ground who've been organizing with the NDP, who've been reporting that their marks, their hard data is suggesting that they're likely to win 44 seats, and there's still some optimism that might happen. What are you hearing? I mean, you've been involved in this work for some time. You know some folks that are doing this work right now, today and over the last few weeks. What are you hearing in terms of what, what's coming to us now is one thing, but what are you hearing from the folks who are on the ground?
Yeah, it's not too different. I think internally that things were tight. That basically a lot of the ground game has been paying off. But what I'll add there is that the ground game that they've been implementing has been largely informed, as much as it is one-on-one, and that's very good. It has largely been informed by the top level of the NDP sending instructions down to the local campaigns to give a specific kind of messaging around Danielle Smith, around trust in leadership, and how it's Rachel Notley versus Danielle Smith rather than issues of cost of living versus austerity with a conservative government. Like, there is positivity on the ground that they're going to win, but I would argue that this is the type of strategy and optimism that's built for speed, but it's not built to last. So as much as I think maybe this was the right strategy, if the goal was let's just win in 2023, the strategy is not going to be one that's going to have some of those like swayed conservative voters coming back in future elections. So it's an optimism that's kind of built on a bit of a false hope, I'll venture to say, because the convincing argument coming from the NDP and local campaigns is that we're better than the guys that you usually vote for, because they're a bit of a shit show right now. And I think that's a super telling message. It's a bit self-defeating because it breaks down immediately as soon as the other guy gets his act together, right? The UCP just needs a little bit more of a boring, less controversial leader with a little less baggage and maybe a bit more moderate. Like, that's a low bar to hit. So as soon as the UCP gets that, then what is the winning argument? What are campaigns going to be saying at the doors to convince people to vote NDP in future elections? So it's a cautious optimism that I'd say, yeah, they've probably put in a lot of work. They should be proud of what they've done, but they should also be thinking long term. Because if you win a one-term government, there's a lot that can be done that's just very quick in 4 years, but it can be undone just as quickly if they lose that power and the UCP gets back in.
Super interesting. Thanks, Romy. Martin, what do you think?
Yeah, I'd love to pick up on something you were talking about, which is like who exactly is setting the strategy. It's very top down. It's driven, in my view, by a kind of clique of consultants. That cycle between different NDP campaigns across the country. I think it behooves us to mention that the director of this campaign is Nathan Rotman, who previously was employed as an Airbnb lobbyist. And last I heard, he was, before joining the campaign, he was evading questions in Montreal from reporters who were reporting on Airbnb, which of course is a predatory platform that has spiked rental prices across the country. He was evading questions about Airbnb, leading to 7 deaths in Montreal thanks to illegal rental units. So to me, I don't think we're going to see that kind of, left-wing populist, politics that actually goes after a political and economic elite that is hoarding wealth, hoarding political power, until we have a very different, composition of who gets to set strategy in the NDP. I like to say that the NDP is essentially like 3 or 4 consultancies in an orange trench coat. It is a trend over the last few decades that has seen, politics and political decision making moving away from any kind of grassroots bottom-up input and left in the hands of a centralized, highly professionalized group of consultants who I think are, for the most part, removed and sometimes indifferent to the interests of ordinary people, whether in Alberta or Ontario. So I think until there's a kind of shakeup in who gets to make these decisions, we're not going to see the kind of politics that I think you're rightly saying we need in the NDP.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I think that there's an entire generation of progressive, political strategists that have been trained by folks from previous generations that, I think we have to admit and be realistic that there was a time where being a leftist really sucked, right? Like it was just full of Red Scare propaganda. The left was being decimated, and so they really had to ensure that the left and parties that leaned to the left survived in a way that was viable at the time, which I think meant shifting towards more of this kind of polite, respectable, liberal Democrat kind of politics. And so I think what we're seeing right now is a lot of that generation and their training and what I was saying before, their third way, really making sure that we're winning the air war, that we're winning the media narratives. I think a lot of that is still dominating. But Martin, where I hold a little bit of hope is that the shakeup is going to happen. I think once we start realizing that we're really losing the working class. And I think the NDP and supporting groups are already starting to feel that. I think we can see it in Alberta, right? It's what I was talking about before. Those folks that are disenfranchised, that hold a lot of anger, that are anti-establishment and anti-elite. Those groups also correlate with folks who have been burned by the system, like I said, but in ways where they're still stuck as working poor. They actually have lower levels of education, and that's not any fault of theirs. It's because we collectively as a society have failed them. And so now they're finding a home within conservative movements because they're signaling that we understand your anger. We know where you're coming from, even though their policy solutions actually are going to burn them in the end too. But that communications exercise is being won by conservatives. And so I think when groups like the NDP, when groups that are really obsessed with this kind of let's win the air war media narrative really start feeling that loss of the working class, I think is when we're just going to have to recalibrate. We're not going to have any choice.
Yeah, I love that answer. My only small quibble is that I don't think there was ever a reason to abandon that working class base, which I think what happened, by consecutive NDP governments, as neoliberalism came into ascendancy in the 80s and 90s. And I think there was as the industrial working class hollowed out and unions became weaker, the NDP was faced with a choice, which I think is a choice that it still faces now, which was, tack to the center, as you said yourself, like make it out to be a more responsible, perhaps slightly more moderately progressive version of the liberals and conservatives that, people tend to vote for. I think the other choice that it had, which it didn't take, was, okay, how do we reestablish connection to, a working class that maybe doesn't look like, the traditional hard-hatted unions of yesteryear, but now is mostly unorganized, is far more racialized, is far more urban. And I think it took the easy road. And I think what we've seen is the kind of hollowing out of party democracy and, the abandonment of working class voters and a lot of non-voters, and I think it's too hard to tell now, but we'll have a sense of this in the coming days about, the kind of rampant abstentionism that we have in this election and so many others across this country. But I think if the NDP, were to see that kind of shakeup and, see a kind of social movement pressure that it hasn't seen in a while, perhaps then it could return to some of those roots of decades past, many decades past, of a CCF style socialist unionism and genuine working class left wing populism. I think that will make a big difference.
I also want to note that in Alberta, especially, the conversation can get a little difficult because the single biggest elephant in the room is always it's that revenue roller coaster, and every time we have this conversation about what can be done and what should be done and how do we go about doing it, every party gets hamstrung by this conversation about well, look, we're gonna try to do what we can, but right now people are hurting, and so we're gonna use oil revenues to do X, Y, and Z, and that's been the formula forever. In 2015, the Alberta NDP just happened to walk into government at a time when oil prices tumbled, and people suffered as a result. But the UCP, I think, disingenuously is putting the blame on the Alberta NDP for how bad things got with falling oil prices in a province that's completely beholden to where are oil prices today, and how is the global cartel of oil conglomerates. How are they doing? How are they feeling this morning? So it does become a really, really difficult conversation, especially when the Alberta NDP did during their 4 years deliver on some really important changes in terms of labor protections. When we talk about the working class, right? I mean, the Farm Bill, for example, which granted was badly communicated, and folks reacted really poorly to it, actually extended worker health and safety insurance to workplace safety insurance to farm workers for the first time in Alberta. And as soon as the legislation was passed, the following year, the province saw an increase in the number of claims under that scheme. The Alberta NDP also brought in card check for making it easier to organize workplaces, and all of those are protections that were rolled back by the UCP immediately after they came into power. And the struggle always is to communicate those as working class victories that were rolled back by the UCP, because we just get pulled into conversations about what to do with the next boom, or how to suffer through the next bust.
No, definitely. And what I would add there is that should really encourage us to think, if the NDP were to win tonight, we should not just sit back and relax and say, okay, whew, we did it. Now let's get these quick wins in. Let's roll back some of the stuff with the UCP. Like, once the NDP gets in, unions, community groups, school boards, parent groups, what have you, anybody within civil society who is listening right now, if the NDP gets in, it should be a call to action to start organizing. That's day one. It is not a time to sit back and relax just because they got in. Clearly, we have an uphill battle. The NDP has an uphill battle. We can't really wait for the NDP or for these parties to bring these solutions for us, because we're running out of time. We're running out of time. We have a climate crisis like right at our doorsteps. It's seeping through our windows. If we had a couple decades, I might be thinking and saying things differently here, but we don't. We're right in the middle of it. And so, NDP gets elected, UCP gets elected, doesn't matter. Day one, we got to pound pavement. We have to start engaging in that communications exercise to start winning those hearts and minds. That's the reality of it.
Really, really valuable contributions as always, Romy. Thank you for coming on and talking to us. This is what a wild election this has been. I remember in 2015 being over the moon when I was involved in that campaign, and the Alberta NDP won. It felt like an impossibility. And we feel, in some ways, I feel like we're still living in all kinds of impossibilities, having a two-party close race in Alberta right now, and the prospect of progressive candidates winning maybe more than 3 seats in Calgary this time around. So, really, really interesting analysis as always, Romy. Thanks so much for coming back on.
Thank you. All right, here's hoping.
Here's hoping. Well, Martin, what are you hearing?
I was so fixated on the conversation that I wasn't tuned into the talking heads on CBC. But I also understand that we have Brad and Emma. I don't know how inebriated they are at this point. Hopefully just a little loose in the tongue. What's the vibe at the lefty redoubt in the brewery?
Well, people are still here, but they cut us off, so we're trying to stay focused, but we're feeling okay.
I don't think there's like big surprises. I think people are kind of like reluctantly watching things unfold, but they're kind of in line with what maybe, people expected or like have resigned themselves to.
Yeah.
What are you thinking in terms of in terms of these results coming in so slowly? I mean, I imagine that's good news for the bar because folks are going to stick around longer and have a few more beers. But what about you? Are you feeling like this bodes one way or the other, or is this just a?
I mean, we've got like 50. What does it say? Like you guys have like 53% of polls reporting, so like it looks like, there's a pretty kind of like constant trend throughout the night, with the UCP staying well ahead. We just saw that Sherwood Park, I think, was called for the NDP. So, there's at least one, kind of like toss-up marginal seat is going to the NDP, but results are coming in slowly. I heard, this is a little bit nerdy, but I heard that they're counting, so they use tabulators in advance vote, but they're counting paper ballots for election.
Yeah, it's my understanding as well.
I think, so I mean, but like it really looks like it's gonna go UCP, guys. I don't know. I don't know what to say.
Weirdly, it's still not possible to call, right? It's weird.
And you guys are like, it's almost. Is it 1 o'clock almost where you guys are? Like, I'm so sorry.
Martin in the
I have
bright glow of 1 a.m.
I also have I have a 9-month-old, and I'll have to be up at like 6:45 in the morning to take care of her. So, but hanging in there for you guys. Should we think about some silver linings? If UCP wins.
Yeah.
I mean, my takeaway in terms of silver linings is, look, Danielle Smith, I think, is like a morbid symptom of a dying system, right? To my mind, she really is this reactionary outburst of a fossil fuel-based elite in Alberta. We heard a little bit about her history earlier. She emerges out of the Wild Rose Party, which itself was a creature of the fossil fuel industry that was outraged at the modest efforts of progressive conservative El Stelmach in terms of just clawing back a bit of their gargantuan profits. And I think she is part of a global dynamic that we're seeing unfold, which is as the question of a transition off oil becomes a more real one, as the fossil fuel-based elite become more and more threatened, we're seeing forces of reaction, including really violent ones, stirring everywhere. I consider, Bolsonaro, Trump, the Saudi dictatorship, all specimens of this, fossil fuel-based reaction. And it's the same here. And like all those leaders, I think Danielle Smith will suffer from a crisis of legitimacy. Like her rule, if it is in fact that at the end of the night, it will be constantly crisis prone in the same way we've seen in the last few months. I'm willing to wager that she won't last very long, and that there will be people within her own party coming for her. So to my mind, that instability is, I think, something that can be taken advantage of. I think it provides opportunities for the left, for the NDP, if they are willing to, seize some of those opportunities that, you've talked about earlier. I think, if the left comes out and social movement, civil society comes out guns blazing, I think there will be more opportunities than we can imagine at this point.
We've talked.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I have two silver linings maybe to talk about. One that is like more, I guess, direct or bounded in some ways. But on the bike ride over here, I was thinking about, the oil and gas industry in particular, and like what that looks like under Danielle Smith. And I think in some ways, the like absolutely unhinged nature of her, the like unpredictability, it is actually potentially a big detriment, I think, to the oil and gas industry. I think it's like creating a very hostile, volatile investment climate in the province. And I actually wouldn't be surprised, you know, Rachel Notley, when she formed government, it was like Suncor, Syncrude CEOs that were willing to back her, that were willing to come on stage. And that was because there's a degree of, you know, we're playing a particular game right now as, you know, oil and gas CEOs. We're pretending there's a facade that we need to keep up. We're sending, you know, massive amounts of lobbyists to COP summits and so on. And I actually think Danielle Smith completely undermines that very strategic game that the oil and gas industry is trying to play. And I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of fossil fuel executives right now watching this election unfold are actually quite worried about that and are like, oh God, this could make us, you know, she's like very unhinged, very unpredictable. So that is one silver lining from my perspective. And then I would say the second, which I take a lot of heart in some ways, is I think finally, from a climate movement perspective, we might have, it's very likely that we have a fossil fuel lobbyist that is about to occupy the Premier's office in the province of Alberta, which I'm sure is maybe not the first time that has happened, or like won't be the last, potentially. I have no idea.
Always happens.
But the point being that a fossil fuel lobbyist being Premier of the single most important province when it comes to climate action in this country sets a precedent of like, we can't rely on inside game anymore. And I think if there's ever been a wake-up call to the climate movement, to social movements, to be like, the government is not going to work for you and you cannot rely on them passing the policies and legislations and being preoccupied with getting at the right tables, getting seats where you need, whatever it might be. Now is the moment to be like, that's not the way to go. And so I hope that this is really a wake-up call to the entire, you know, climate movement, but social movements writ large across the country, to be like, inside game is not enough. We need an outside game strategy. We need to build working class power, as Romy was talking about. We need to be undermining the pillars of support that like prop up these governance systems that really in a lot of ways should hold no legitimacy with working people. You go.
I mean, you nailed it. To like pick on that a little bit, like Martin, like I think that like one silver lining for me is that like agree wholeheartedly with what Romy said in terms of the UCP. Like it was a juggernaut that was built for speed, but not to last. And I don't think Danielle Smith can like be driving that big blue truck in the same way that Kenney was. And like, remember what he said? He was like, the lunatics are trying to like take over the asylum or whatever it was, some like offensive phrase about like his base. And like, they built this huge party that was like, had really broad stakes that like, I think if, you know, they end up with like, even if they have 53 seats at the end of the night, it's going to be a really volatile party and a really volatile governing situation for her within caucus that leaves us a lot of opportunities to sort of think about, you know, whether or not we're going to the polls within a year or two. But really, when it comes to like broad-based civil society, environmental groups, and like other organizations that are thinking about how to influence, you know, that instability, there's so much volatility that we can play with, which is really exciting. And, you know, like, man, Emma, when you were talking, like I remember talking to like Mike Kudima from Greenpeace after like 2015, and in the transition period, he had a meeting with like Brian Topp and you know, Rachel and a few other people, and was like, came out and he was like, I think I'm gonna move to BC, basically. Like he's just like, oh, there's no hope for an inside strategy here at the level that we really want to see change happen at the pace we need it to happen, right? Like we need to be here for like a good time, not a long time, when it comes to like governing as like NDP governments. And it just was a real kind of like eye-opening experience for, I think, a small handful of people in 2015 to 2019 that I think is going to be more broad-based coming out of this election, where like they put everything towards a very timid, careful, you know, triangulation, shopping for vote strategy in Calgary, essentially in the donut in Edmonton, that, you know, may or may not work out at the end of the night. We'll see what happens. But I think, you know, we've talked about like emergency conversations that need to happen in civil society and like outside of the electoral process, that I think is a silver lining. And it doesn't mean that like we're actually that excited about a UCP government probably being formed after tonight. Obviously not. Like there's a lot of threat to that, but I do hope, and I think it will be a potential wake-up call for like really building for power on the left in Alberta in a way that we just didn't see like in 2015, because people were like, Addie and I were there at the Westin in 2015 when they formed government. It was just like, oh shit, like no one thought this could happen 2 weeks before the election happened. And then it happened and everything's going to be fine. And it obviously wasn't fine. And so I do think that people learned a lesson through the last like 2 election cycles that I hope we can translate into like the potential for real organizing power, because there was a real sort of like strategic focus on like just that like those sliver of votes in Calgary. And like, I really believe personally that people want some sort of like bigger vision that actually like, you know, can touch what people want to like believe in. And like, there was no, I mean, it was tonight like with a friend, where it was like, there's no real story in this election for the NDP that they were telling. It was just sort of like, I think looking really closely at the polls and really looking at like how they could pick off and target those like slivers of votes in Calgary. And
can I just jump in there for a second, yeah. Brad and Emma? I'm wondering, you've touched on this. I love your silver linings. I think they're really, really crucial for us to be able to move forward in a way that's constructive and hopeful. But one of the things you mentioned was the 2015-2019 effect of folks sort of realizing or feeling like there's maybe not really all that much hope for an inside strategy, and maybe it's time to move on and figure something else out. Is there a silver lining? You mentioned also that this might be a wake-up call. Both of you have said that in different ways. But is there a silver lining there that wake-up call could mean that the Alberta NDP does think about a way forward where which is in fact that provides an avenue for there to be some sort of inside strategy, that provides an avenue for there to be some sort of opportunity to organize and kind of advance this important agenda?
I would say that I'm not holding my breath on the NDP all of a sudden having this like moment of awakening where all of a sudden they're like, hey, maybe we should talk to these people that are at this brewery in Edmonton and who have felt completely alienated and ostracized by this, entire election campaign. And there might be something there. Like, I don't think they're going to get there, Addie, to be honest. I think that they really are just like in a place where regardless of what we say, they're willing to really write us off and be like, there are so many other reasons why we didn't win. And it's not because of this. And like, these people don't have a valuable contribution to make. And I would say, who cares? Like, I am not seeking the legitimacy and like affirmation of the NDP when it comes to strategy anymore whatsoever. And I think a lot of people within labor, within the institutional left in this province now, have finally gotten to a place where, and I think this is absolutely necessary, we're not sitting in coalition meetings willingly trying to just constantly placate them, and are actually like, we have hundreds of thousands of workers at our disposal. We have members who need to be organized, and that is our path to not only resistance but victory. That's where the power needs to be built. I do think that should, Danielle Smith get elected tonight, there's a very likely chance that, Rachel Notley may resign as leader. I think this probably will be her last election as leader. I think that there's an opening there to really like run a bold left candidate who can put forward a transformative vision for the province. And I think a lot of people would, come alongside behind that. I think as someone who like hasn't been organizing in the province of Alberta for too long, something that I love about this place is like, we don't have a lot of time and opportunity for like bullshit amongst each other. Like, it's like we're constantly having to work through our shit and come up with like, okay, what is the fighting strategy and how do we get there? And I think this really like heightens that need that already exists. And so I do think that like the broad-based coalitions, the demand of like coming together is like going to be feeling, very strong in this moment. Anyways, you hop in. I don't know where.
Can I just like jump off on that, or do you want to? I just wanted to say like, okay.
I don't care if the NDP recognizes that we're right, is what I'm saying.
Right, I know you don't care about the NDP. I know.
Well, not at all.
No, I know, not at all. Obviously, we're like, like the results are going to come in, but I think that like there's a lesson to be learned here about like the role and responsibility that civil society and outside organizations have to play. And I think that like accepting like that responsibility and like moving into like the power that we don't have but that we want to have. I think like on the left, it's like so interesting where it's like, man, like Em and I have like talked a lot over the past couple of years, like convoy, like, response, like, what are we going to do with like the electoral like question, working with the labor movement. And like, it's like, like Martin, you were saying like, like the NDP is like 3 strategists in a trench coat. Civil society and like, the left in Alberta is like 10 people in a trench coat, maybe 15. I don't know. Like it's a small group of people. No, it's more than that. But there's like an opportunity, I think, that like we have coming out of this election to like have a real conversation, but we have to seize on it, right? Like, cause there's a real sort of like, I think, there's a real sort of like self-protectiveness within the party, within like the NDP sections in the country, where like you have an election and then there's like this debrief process and everyone gets together who's like on the campaign and says like, okay, here's the narrative and here's how we're going to talk to our membership and our supporters. And the narrative is, this is the best we could have done. But we want to do better next time, essentially. I mean, that's like very crass. But I think what civil society and like the left needs to do in Alberta coming out of this, like, tonight, and we'll see what happens, obviously. Like, there's a lot of night to go. But like getting people in a room and actually having an honest conversation and looking yourselves in the mirror, to quote like, people, who, it's not a good kind of thing to think about, but like, we need to actually say like, okay, like why didn't the NDP run on like bringing like private surgical initiatives back into the public healthcare system? Why didn't they run on defunding private schools and charter schools, right? Like, and it's like, that's what PIA is all about. And so I'm kind of looking myself in the mirror right now, but like, how do we like take stock of like why we didn't build power through an inside strategy? And then ask the question whether or not there were too many resources that went towards that, and whether or not there's a conversation to be had about whether those were like overused resources or wasted resources, and think about like where we can spend our energy, because like it's limited resources in the left here in Alberta.
And can you like this is a really crucial, I think, a conversation in terms of what happens next. And there's going to be a lot of introspection, I imagine, and a lot of dissection of what happened and how the campaign was run and why certain things turned out the way they did, and then some recommendations and choices that'll have to be made in terms of, okay, does this mean, which direction do we go from here? And what I'm hearing from both of you is, maybe there's going to be an opportunity here for civil society to create the political space for the NDP to choose to go in the right direction as it moves forward. But I want you to sort of unpack that responsibility piece a little bit more, because Ricardo also touched on it, kind of talking about, we have to take stock of what civil society has been able to accomplish in order to allow the political party that ostensibly is there to advance civil society's agenda. What are we able to do to give them that space to take those positions? Can you unpack that responsibility piece a bit more? Like, is that the conversations that you're hearing right now as we sort of think about next steps? And what's that risk of the NDP actually deciding to go further to the right after all of this?
Do you want me to go off first?
Yeah, you go first.
Okay, like first of all, I don't know if it's like if the NDP in Alberta sees their role as, sort of carrying forward the vision of civil society and the left and, social democrats in the province, even though it's, buried in our policy and our constitution. I think that there's a real conversation to be had between like people that Emma and I are very close with, and like so many activists across the province, including Romy and others, about whether and how we spend our limited resources in relation to political parties, you know, especially the NDP, if there is a leadership question. But I think more importantly, for me anyway, I think there's a real sense that like, if you look at Calgary and you look at Edmonton, you look at the like three-legged stool, there's a real sense that the campaign and the party could take for granted voters in Edmonton, primarily, and across the province who were like further on the left of the NDP in general, and also in terms of their offer in this election, and basically get away with it and try to form a government in Calgary with like, you know, the switchers or whatever. And I don't exactly know if that's a wise strategy in the long term. And I definitely don't think it's a wise strategy in the short term, because there's something about like the engine of a political party that is really, really kind of like connected to the culture of political activism. And, you know, like over the last 10 to 12 years, I've seen, and just like people that I know and love, like just sort of, you know, move away from the political party and like be like, oh, I'll never go back, right? And it's like, you know, campaign managers and like really badass activists and things like that. And I know it's like hard to measure the value of that in terms of like, you know, the NDP's, you know, electoral like chances or whatever. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that I think like over the long term, there's a real kind of like movement towards the wilderness of the Alberta NDP, and they don't necessarily know what their identity is anymore.
Is the question, Adi, like what is the responsibility of the NDP and the party, or what is the responsibility of civil society?
Yeah, just to wrap up our conversation here, Emma, we'll if you want to, yeah, just reflect on that responsibility bit as we and you know, you had such important insights into like that silver lining piece. Just tying that up a bit, like what do we do as we move forward as civil society to create that space, and then we'll leave it at there.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I would say is that I'm like not holding out hopes for the NDP all of a sudden having this sort of moment of reckoning where they realize, you know, the importance of connecting and energizing their base. And I think it's incumbent upon us as organizers on the left to now be like, now is our time, in resistance to and on the offensive of whatever government is formed ultimately at the end of tonight, to say there's a battle to be waged right now, and every single working person in this province has a role to play. And I would say that, yeah, I think ultimately Alberta is maybe the single most important sort of ground and site to realize that the electoral left, so to speak, which is so unmoored, when it is unmoored from the working class and it's willing to just shift all over the place and become the center right, is not going to be an effective vehicle for working people. And so in that situation, it's incumbent upon us as civil society, as organizations, to as, you know, leftist institutions like the labor movement and so on and so forth, to really build working class power in order to like anchor that. And the NDP will follow suit. And so that's the task of our time. That's where we're going. That's what's needed. And I feel somewhat optimistic, at least, that people in Alberta are ready for that they recognize the importance of it, that they know, even, you know, when Rachel Notley was elected in 2015, there were public sector workers in this province that got zeros. And so we know not to take those, you know, those things for granted. And I think that, if anything, will hopefully set the stage and be a lesson for the left across the country.
Can I just like
one quick thing? Unfortunately, we're out of time, Brad. I'm really sorry, but
you'll have to find those insights in the pint.
Well, I'll send them out to share them. Yeah, elsewhere.
Okay.
But what great points, and what a great note to wrap that discussion on. Emma, thank you. Thanks, Brad, for coming back.
Martin needs to go to bed.
Yeah, Martin, I'll hand it over to you.
It's true. No, thanks so much for joining us, you two. And look forward to seeing what kind of grassroots civil society resistance you guys can muster. We'll be cheering you guys on from afar.
Thanks, Martin. Thanks for having us.
Good to see you.
Thanks for coming.
See you guys.
Oh no, I think I've lost Addie, my intrepid co-host. Gone at the end of the night. Well, maybe he'll join. If not, I hope our viewers at home found these conversations to be useful, thought-provoking, and maybe a little inspiring. Despite the grim realities we know the province is going to be facing probably in the next 4 years. Thanks for all those who've tuned in. We hope you can continue to follow and support our work. We had a small but mighty team bringing you this ambitious program for tonight. Please consider donating if you can to keep our work going. You can go to breachmedia.ca to do that. If you haven't subscribed to our YouTube channel or our podcast, you can do that now. And we'll be signing off, but the votes will continue to be counted. And I imagine sometime into the wee hours in Mountain Time, there will be a winner called, probably the UCP at this point. It looks like that margin of victory seems to be holding. So, but we might not know till tomorrow morning. Addie?
Well, listen, thanks everybody for sticking with us. It's been a long night. It's certainly been a long night out here in Ottawa and Montreal. Those of you in Alberta, we're going to be thinking of you, and it's going to be a difficult result for a lot of folks who've been suffering already, and I think we've had some really inspiring insight from folks who are really trying to work to build a better future for us all. So thank you all for sticking with us. Thanks everyone, and good night.